December 16th, 1985. 5:30 in the evening. Paul Castellano steps out of his car outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. He runs the most powerful crime family in America, protected for years by connections nobody could buy and loyalty nobody dared question. 6 bullets later, none of that mattered. The men who killed him were not rivals from another family. They were his own. In this video, we break down 10 cartel bosses killed by their own men. Case 1. Salvador El Chava Gomez Herrera, Gulf Cartel, 1999. Salvador Gomez Herrera went by the nickname El Chava, and for a short stretch in the late 1990s, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Osiel Cardenas Guillen at the top of the Gulf Cartel, one of the oldest and most powerful smuggling organizations on the Mexican border. The two men ran the cartel together out of Matamoros, the border city across the river from Brownsville, Texas. Gomez Herrera was not just a business partner to Cardenas. He was a close friend, and by the summer of 1999, he was also the godfather of Cardenas's baby daughter. That same year, on the direct order of the man who called him a friend, Gomez Herrera was shot dead by a former Mexican army soldier working for the cartel. The killing put Cardenas in full control of the Gulf Cartel and earned him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life, El Mata Amigos, which means the friend killer. It is one of the clearest examples in the history of Mexican organized crime of a boss being taken out not by police, not by soldiers, and not by a rival cartel, but by the very man he trusted most. The roots of this killing go back to January 1996, when the Gulf Cartel's longtime boss, Juan Garcia Abrego, was captured by Mexican authorities and extradited to the United States, where he would eventually receive 11 life sentences. Garcia Abrego had spent nearly 2 decades building the Gulf Cartel into a multi-billion-dollar operation, moving cocaine and marijuana across the border with the help of corrupt police, soldiers, and politicians. His arrest tore that structure apart overnight. Several men tried to step into the vacancy and failed. His brother, Humberto Garcia Abrego, attempted to take control but lacked both the reputation and the connections to hold the organization together. 2 other men being groomed for leadership, Oscar Malherbe de Leon and Raúl Valladares del Ángel, were arrested a short time later. Malherbe reportedly tried to bribe his way out of custody with $2 million, and the offer was refused. Another candidate, a smuggler known as El Checo Gomez, was assassinated in April 1996, before he could consolidate any real power. Out of that chaos, 2 men rose together. One was Osiel Cardenas Guillen, a former car mechanic from Matamoros, who had worked his way into the drug trade through small-time cocaine sales. The other was Salvador Gomez Herrera, known as El Chava, a trafficker with his own networks and his own ambitions. For a while, the partnership worked. Cardenas and Gomez Herrera combined their connections in the criminal underworld of Tamaulipas with their contacts inside local police departments and government offices. Together, they took control of major drug shipments coming up from Guatemala, and they used bribery to keep law enforcement looking the other way. On the surface, the 2 men appeared to be equals, running the cartel side by side, the way Garcia Abrego once had alone. Underneath that surface, tension was already building. According to accounts of the partnership, Gomez Herrera had a manipulative streak that grated on Cardenas over time. He repeatedly asked Cardenas for money, treating their business relationship less like a partnership between equals and more like a source of personal loans. Cardenas found this behavior insulting, and it planted the first seed of resentment in a relationship that had started out as a genuine friendship. Slowly, Cardenas began pulling together his own group of loyal men inside the cartel. separate from anyone connected to Gomez Herrera. He was not yet ready to move against his partner, but he was no longer content to simply share power with him either. The turning point in this story came through a man named Arturo Guzman de Sena, a soldier in the Mexican Army's Special Forces unit known as the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, or GAFE. Guzman de Sena had grown up poor in the state of Puebla and joined the military as a teenager to escape that poverty. He proved to be a talented and aggressive soldier, and by the mid-1990s, he had earned a spot in one of the most elite combat units in the Mexican Armed Forces, receiving specialized training in counterinsurgency and explosives, some of it from foreign instructors. While serving as a security chief in the border town of Miguel Alemán, Tamaulipas, Guzman de Sena caught the attention of Cárdenas, who began paying him for favors and information. In 1997, Guzman de Sena made the decision to walk away from the army entirely and work full-time for the Gulf Cartel. This was unusual. Soldiers on the border had long taken bribes from traffickers, but very few actually deserted the military to join a cartel outright. Cárdenas now had something Gomez Herrera did not: a trained soldier with real combat skills who answered to him personally and to no one else. With Guzman de Sena in his corner, Cárdenas had the tool he needed to settle the growing resentment he felt toward his partner. The final piece of this story is almost impossible to read without a sense of disbelief because of how personal the setting was. In the summer of 1999, Cárdenas and his wife held a baptism ceremony for their baby daughter. Gomez Herrera, the man Cárdenas had built an empire beside, was chosen to be the child's godfather, a role in Mexican culture that represents one of the deepest forms of trust a family can extend to an outsider. Gomez Herrera attended the ceremony, believing his friendship with Cárdenas was as solid as it had ever been. There was no indication, at least none that Gomez Herrera acted on, that anything had changed between them. After the baptism ended, Cárdenas invited his friend and new compadre to ride together in his Dodge Durango, a simple and ordinary gesture between two men who had built a criminal empire side by side. That ride never had an ordinary ending. On Cárdenas's order, Guzman de Sena carried out the killing of Gomez Herrera as the two men traveled together, shooting him dead inside the vehicle he had just been invited into as an honored guest. The man who had stood at the christening of Cárdenas's daughter only hours earlier was now dead by the hand of a soldier following Cárdenas's direct instructions. With that single order, Cárdenas eliminated the only man who shared real power inside the Gulf Cartel, and he did it using the very ceremony meant to celebrate trust and family as the setting for the betrayal. There were no rival gunmen involved, no ambush from an outside enemy, and no soldiers from the Mexican government closing in. The only people responsible for Gomez Herrera's death were members of his own organization, acting on the orders of the man who had called him family only hours before. Word of what happened did not stay quiet for long. A journalist named Juan Raúl Bermúdez Núñez, who worked for a local paper called El Diario de Matamoros, interviewed Cárdenas directly in the months following the killing. During that interview, Cárdenas openly admitted that he was the leader of the Gulf Cartel, and Bermúdez Núñez went on to publish an article describing how Cárdenas had ordered the killing of his own friend and business partner. The story spread quickly through Matamoros and beyond, and it was this reporting that helped attach the nickname El Mata Amigos to Cárdenas for the rest of his criminal career. Cárdenas was furious about the exposure and reportedly threatened to kill the journalist over what he had written. Bermúdez Núñez did not back down quietly. Instead, He eventually became an informant for American law enforcement, providing information to the DEA and FBI about the inner workings of the cartel he had once simply reported on from a distance. The killing of Gomez Herrera also marked a shift in how boldly Cardenas was willing to operate. Only a few months after taking full control of the cartel, in November of 1999, Cardenas and a group of his men surrounded a vehicle carrying 2 American federal agents, one from the DEA and one from the FBI, along with an informant, as they drove through the streets of Matamoros. Cardenas's gunmen demanded the agents hand over the informant riding with them, a request that almost certainly would have ended in the informant's torture and death. The agents refused to comply, reportedly warning Cardenas that killing federal agents would bring consequences far beyond anything he had dealt with before. Cardenas eventually backed down and let the agents go, but not before making it clear whose territory they were standing in. This single event, occurring so soon after the murder of his own partner, showed how far Cardenas's confidence had grown now that there was no one left inside his own organization to challenge him. Despite how well documented the killing of Gomez Herrera became through Bermudez Núñez's reporting and later law enforcement files, no formal criminal trial in Mexico or the United States ever charged anyone specifically for that murder. Arturo Guzmán de Sena, the man who pulled the trigger, went on to become one of the founding members of a new paramilitary group inside the Gulf Cartel, one built entirely from Mexican army deserters that Cardenas asked him to recruit. That group would eventually become known as Los Zetas, one of the most violent criminal organizations in the history of Mexico. Guzmán de Sena never had to answer for the killing of Gomez Herrera in a courtroom because in November of 2002, he himself was shot dead by Mexican army soldiers inside a restaurant in Matamoros, cut down in the same border city where he had once carried out the order that made Cardenas the undisputed boss of the Gulf Cartel. Cardenas's own legal reckoning came years later, and through a different set of charges entirely. In March of 2003, after a 6-month secret military operation known only to Mexico's president, defense secretary, and attorney general, Cardenas was cornered in Matamoros and captured following a shootout between his gunmen and Mexican soldiers. He was held in Mexico's highest security prisons for years while fighting extradition, and in January of 2007, he was finally handed over to the United States. He stood trial in a federal court in Houston, and in March of 2010, Cardenas pleaded guilty, not to the murder of his friend Salvador Gomez Herrera, but to conspiracy to distribute cocaine and marijuana, money laundering, and threatening the 2 American federal agents during the 1999 standoff in Matamoros. The killing that had defined his reputation and given him his nickname was never the charge that put him behind bars in the United States. It was, in the end, the drug trafficking and the threats against American law enforcement that finally caught up with him in a courtroom. On the same day he entered his guilty plea, a United States federal court sentenced Cardenas to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an order to forfeit $50 million in proceeds from his criminal enterprise. In plain terms, this meant Cardenas would serve the full quarter-century behind bars, with no chance of early release through a parole board, and the government would seize tens of millions of dollars in cash, property, and assets connected to his years running the Gulf Cartel. He spent time in some of the most secure federal facilities in the country, including the highly restrictive ADX Florence in Colorado, before eventually being moved through several other federal prisons and finally settling at USP Terre Haute in Indiana. Cardenas's story did not end quietly inside an American prison cell. On August 30th, 2024, after serving about 14 years of his 25-year sentence, Cardenas was released from federal custody and placed in the hands of United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It was not publicly explained why he did not serve his full term. Just over 3 months later, on December 16, 2024, he was walked across the border and formally returned to Mexican custody, where he was immediately arrested to face charges in his home country, including homicide and other violent crimes. He is currently held at the Altiplano prison, one of the most secure facilities in Mexico, located just outside Mexico City. The empire he built by killing his own friend did not survive intact either. The Zetas, the group born from Guzman de Sena's recruitment efforts, eventually broke away from the Gulf Cartel entirely and became one of Mexico's deadliest independent criminal organizations in their own right. The Gulf Cartel itself splintered into rival factions with names like the Metros, the Cyclones, the Reds, and the Scorpions, spending years locked in bloody infighting long after the man who once ran it alone had already been sent away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Cardenas eliminated his partner quietly inside a family car after a baptism, the next boss on this list met his end in a much more public setting, gunned down in broad daylight on a Cancun street by the very man he had personally trained to take his place. Case 2. Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, Juarez Cartel, 1993. Rafael Aguilar Guajardo spent the first part of his career wearing a badge instead of carrying a rifle for a cartel. He worked as a commander inside the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, known as the DFS, which served for decades as Mexico's main intelligence and security agency. The DFS had a long history of being tied up in state repression and corruption, and it eventually became infiltrated from top to bottom by drug traffickers who used their government positions as cover for smuggling. Aguilar Guajardo was one of those men. Internal DFS records from as early as 1977 showed him directly involved in moving heroin across the border, working alongside other corrupt officials who reported drug quantities and profits straight up the chain like it was any other government job. By the time he left law enforcement behind entirely, Aguilar Guajardo had built the exact kind of criminal network that a career in Mexican intelligence made possible, and he used it to help found one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the country, the Juarez Cartel. In April of 1993, that same organization turned on him. He was gunned down on a family vacation in Cancun, on the orders of the man he had personally trained and promoted, his own second-in-command, Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The Juarez Cartel traces its roots back to the 1970s, when a trafficker named Pablo Acosta Villarreal built a smuggling operation along the border near Ojinaga, Chihuahua, using small aircraft to move drugs into the United States. Acosta had close ties to several men connected to the larger Guadalajara cartel, which at the time functioned almost like an umbrella organization over multiple regional smuggling groups across Mexico. Rafael Aguilar Guajardo worked as Acosta's right-hand man during this period, learning the smuggling business from the ground up while still maintaining his connections inside Mexican law enforcement. In April of 1987, Mexican federal police helicopters carried out a cross-border raid into a small Rio Grande village called Santa Elena, and Pablo Acosta was killed in the operation. With his mentor gone, Aguilar Guajardo stepped into the leadership vacuum and took control of the Juarez smuggling corridor, one of the most valuable drug trafficking routes into the United States because of its direct access to El Paso, Texas. Around this same time, the wider Guadalajara cartel began to fracture. Its most powerful leader, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, was arrested in 1989 following years of pressure from Mexican and American authorities tied to the 1985 kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. As the old Guadalajara structure broke apart into smaller regional cartels, Aguilar Guajardo was recognized as the boss of the Juarez Plaza in his own right, no longer answering to anyone above him. To help run this growing operation, Aguilar Guajardo brought in a young man named Amado Carrillo Fuentes and made him his second in command. Amado came from a family already deep in the drug trade. His uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, had been one of the founding leaders of the Guadalajara cartel, and it was Don Neto who first introduced Amado to the business, putting him in charge of overseeing shipments while he was still young. Under Aguilar Guajardo's mentorship, Amado learned how to move drugs using aircraft on a scale that most traffickers at the time had never attempted, flying loads of cocaine north through Mexico's Golden Triangle region, an area covering parts of Chihuahua, Durango, and Sinaloa that had long served as a corridor for the drug trade. Aguilar Guajardo trusted Amado with more and more responsibility as the Juarez cartel expanded its reach, and on paper, the two men functioned as a well-organized team, with Aguilar Guajardo running the overall business and political connections, while Amado handled logistics and transportation. From the outside, there was no reason to think the partnership would end in anything other than continued success for both men. By the start of the 1990s, cracks were beginning to form in Aguilar Guajardo's position, even if they were not yet visible to everyone around him. In 1989, a major drug bust in Los Angeles, connected to the Juarez cartel's network, changed the pressure Aguilar Guajardo was under, exposing parts of his operation to American law enforcement in a way that had not happened before. One of his close associates, connected to that network, a man named Rafael Munoz, was arrested in 1991, and the investigation surrounding that arrest continued to tighten around Aguilar Guajardo personally. By 1993, Mexican authorities had issued a warrant for his arrest, forcing him to abandon any sense of a normal, settled life and go on the run. This was a serious shift for a man who had spent years building his power through corrupt connections inside the very government now hunting him. Aguilar Guajardo apparently believed he still held leverage, and in the days before his death, he reportedly threatened to expose the identities of high-level government officials who had been protecting him for years, a threat that would have caused serious damage to powerful people well beyond the world of drug trafficking. While Aguilar Guajardo dealt with mounting legal pressure and prepared to use his political connections as a bargaining chip, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was quietly building his own plans. According to later reporting, Amado had already begun plotting to remove his mentor from power, recognizing that a boss on the run from the law, making threats against powerful officials, had become a serious liability to the entire organization rather than an asset. Despite the danger closing in around him, Aguilar Guajardo still tried to hold on to some version of a normal family life. In April of 1993, he traveled to the resort city of Cancun on Mexico's Caribbean coast to spend the Easter holiday with his family, bringing along more than a dozen relatives, including his wife and young son. For a man being actively hunted by Mexican authorities, choosing a major tourist destination for a family vacation might seem like an unusual decision, but Cancun offered a kind of anonymity that a smaller town could not, with crowds of tourists and a constant flow of visitors from all over the world, making it easier to blend in. During the trip, Aguilar Guajardo took part in ordinary vacation activities with his family, including a tour aboard a submarine that took tourists along the coastline to view the reef and marine life beneath the surface. It was the kind of quiet, unremarkable family outing that thousands of tourists experienced in Cancun every year, and there was nothing about the day that suggested anything was about to go wrong. On April 12, 1993, shortly after finishing the submarine tour, Aguilar Guajardo and his family made their way toward Gypsy's restaurant, located in the heart of Cancun's busy tourist strip. Gunfire suddenly erupted outside the restaurant, tearing through the crowded street in the middle of a holiday weekend. Aguilar Guajardo was killed in the shooting, along with an American tourist who had the misfortune of being caught in the middle of the attack. His wife and his 11-year-old son were both wounded by the gunfire, but survived. The attack was carried out by men who had been hired to kill him, and according to multiple accounts that emerged in the years that followed, those men had been hired by Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the same second-in-command Aguilar Guajardo had trained and trusted with running the operational side of the Juarez cartel for years. There was no rival cartel involved in the shooting, no law enforcement operation closing in, and no outside enemy responsible for what happened outside that restaurant. The order came from inside Aguilar Guajardo's own organization, from the man who owed his entire position in the criminal underworld to the mentorship Aguilar Guajardo had provided him. In the aftermath of the shooting, Mexican authorities moved quickly to seize what remained of Aguilar Guajardo's fortune. The Attorney General of Mexico's office confiscated assets connected to him valued at more than $100 million, including multiple nightclubs, several houses, and a large 7,000 square meter property in the resort city of Acapulco. The scale of these holdings gave investigators and the public a clearer picture of just how much wealth Aguilar Guajardo had accumulated during his years running the Juarez smuggling corridor, wealth built through a combination of drug trafficking profits and his earlier years of corruption inside Mexican intelligence. As details of the killing became clearer over time, it became widely understood among Mexican and American law enforcement that Amado Carrillo Fuentes had orchestrated the hit in order to seize control of the cartel for himself. The timing lined up closely with Aguilar Guajardo's threat to expose government contacts, suggesting that Amado may have moved against his mentor, at least in part, to prevent that threat from ever being carried out, protecting both the cartel's corrupt relationships and his own path to becoming the sole leader of the organization. No formal criminal trial was ever held for the murder of Rafael Aguilar Guajardo. The men who carried out the shooting on the street outside Gypsy's restaurant were never publicly identified or brought before a court, and Amado Carrillo Fuentes himself was never arrested or charged in connection with ordering the killing. Instead of facing any legal consequences, Amado stepped directly into the leadership role his mentor had once held, taking full control of the Juarez cartel almost immediately after the assassination. Under his leadership, the organization grew far beyond what it had been under Aguilar Guajardo, expanding into one of the most powerful drug trafficking operations in the world during the 1990s. Amado became known internationally by the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, meaning the Lord of the Skies, a name he earned by using a private fleet of commercial and cargo aircraft to move enormous quantities of cocaine from Colombia into Mexico before it continued on into the United States. He eventually brought his own brothers, Vicente and Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, into leadership positions within the cartel, building a family-run operation on the exact foundation his own mentor had once built for him. Since no trial ever took place, there were no victim impact statements read in a courtroom and no formal sentence handed down for the man who ordered Aguilar Guajardo's death. The closest thing to any kind of reckoning came years later, and it had nothing to do with the justice system. In July of 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes died during a plastic surgery procedure in Mexico City that he had undergone in an attempt to alter his appearance and avoid capture by authorities who had been closing in on him for years. He never stood before a judge for the murder of Rafael Aguilar Guajardo or for any of the other crimes committed during his years running the Juarez cartel. His death left behind a leadership vacuum that triggered a brief but violent power struggle within the organization, echoing the exact same kind of internal instability that had followed his own rise to power 4 years earlier. Following Amado's death, his brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes eventually took control of the Juarez cartel and led the organization through a bloody war with the rival Sinaloa cartel that lasted for years and left thousands of people dead in Ciudad Juarez. Vicente himself was eventually captured by Mexican authorities in 2014 and extradited to the United States in 2025. The Juarez cartel never returned to the level of power it held under Amado during the 1990s, and by the early 2010s, control of most of its former smuggling routes had shifted to the Sinaloa cartel. What remains of the organization today operates on a much smaller scale, relying on an enforcement arm known as La Línea, made up largely of current and former corrupt police officers, and its most recent known leader is a man named Juan Pablo Ledesma. The empire that Rafael Aguilar Guajardo helped build, and that his own second-in-command took from him with a bullet on a crowded tourist street, never fully recovered its former strength after the men who built it were gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pattern in this case, a trusted second-in-command turning on the boss who raised him up, repeats itself again and again across the history of organized crime. And the next case on this list follows almost the same script in a completely different country. In Colombia, one of the most feared cartel bosses of the 2000s would meet a nearly identical fate, betrayed not by a single protege, but by 2 of his own top lieutenants working together. That betrayal would end with his body found in a rented cabin hundreds of miles from home, in a country he had fled to for safety. Case 3. Wilber Varela, Chabón, Norte del Valle Cartel, 2008. Wilber Alirio Varela Fajardo went by several names in the Colombian underworld, but the one that stuck was Jabón, which means soap in Spanish. He started his working life as a police officer before drifting into the world of contract killing, eventually rising to become the top boss of the Norte del Valle Cartel, one of the most powerful cocaine trafficking organizations to come out of Colombia after the fall of the larger Medellin and Cali cartels. Varela built his entire career on violence, loyalty, and paranoia in roughly equal measure, and for years, those qualities kept him alive while nearly everyone around him was arrested, extradited, or killed. In January of 2008, that streak ended. Varela was found shot dead inside a rented vacation cabin in the mountain town of Mérida, Venezuela, alongside his own bodyguard. The men responsible for his death were not rivals from another cartel or agents from a foreign government. They were his own top lieutenants, men who had worked under him for years, men he had personally trusted to run his organization's most violent operations. Varela's rise inside the drug trade began after the collapse of the Cali cartel in the mid-1990s, when its 4 leaders were captured or killed and their vast smuggling network splintered into pieces. Out of that wreckage rose the Norte del Valle cartel, based in the northern part of Colombia's Valle del Cauca province. Varela worked as the head of security and chief hitman for one of the cartel's early leaders, Orlando Henao Montoya, a former policeman known as El Hombre del Overol, meaning the man in overalls. In this role, Varela carried out assassinations on Henao's orders, eliminating rivals, silencing suspected informants, and cleaning up loose ends whenever a killing threatened to expose the organization. In November of 1996, Varela was involved in the killing of Efrain Hernandez Ramirez, known as Don Efra, the cartel's second-in-command, who was murdered by his own employee after Henao grew suspicious that Hernandez was preparing to cooperate with American drug agents. This kind of internal killing was not unusual inside the Norte del Valle cartel. It was simply how business was conducted at the highest levels, and Varela was often the man carrying out the orders. Varela's own life nearly ended years before his actual death. In March of 1996, gunmen opened fire on him along the road between the cities of Cali and Rosso, wounding him seriously enough that he needed emergency medical care. Two of his own bodyguards at the time, brothers named Javier and Luis Enrique Calle Serna, pulled him from the scene and rushed him to a clinic in Cali, saving his life. These two brothers would remain close to Varela for years afterward, working their way up through his organization and becoming known throughout Colombia by the shared nickname Comba. In November of 1997, Varela survived a second assassination attempt, this one ordered by a rival Cali cartel figure named Pacho Herrera. Rather than let the attack go unanswered, Varela asked Henao for permission to retaliate. Henao hesitated at first, wanting to avoid a wider war, but eventually gave his approval after learning that Herrera had been quietly cooperating with American drug agents. In November of 1998, a hitman connected to Varela and Henao shot and killed Pacho Herrera inside a Colombian prison. Only 9 days later, Henao himself was murdered inside his own prison cell, killed in revenge by a relative of Herrera's who had smuggled weapons in specifically for that purpose. The chain of retaliation left the Norte del Valle cartel without its top leader and split the organization into two competing factions almost overnight. One faction formed around Diego León Montoya Sanchez, known as Don Diego, who built a private army called Los Machos. The other formed around Varela himself, who set up his own armed wing around 2002 and put it under the command of a loyal lieutenant named Diego Pérez Henao, known on the street as Diego Rastrojo. Varela named the group Los Rastrojos after his own underworld nickname, and it quickly grew into one of the most feared paramilitary forces operating on Colombia's Pacific coast. War between the two factions broke out in the fall of 2003 after a failed assassination attempt on Varela, which he blamed on Montoya's people. What followed was one of the bloodiest periods of gang warfare Colombia had seen in years, with more than 1,000 people killed between 2003 and 2005 as the two sides fought for control of smuggling routes, cocaine laboratories, and territory across the Valle del Cauca region. American authorities estimated that the Norte del Valle cartel had exported roughly 500 metric tons of cocaine into the United States since 1990, worth more than $10 billion, and both Varela and Montoya were formally indicted by federal grand juries in the United States in March of 2004 on drug trafficking and racketeering charges. The pressure on Varela only grew heavier from there. Colombian authorities carried out a series of operations against his network, seizing millions of dollars in cash, counterfeit currency, vehicles, and weapons connected to his organization. Facing indictment in the United States and a shrinking list of places where he could safely operate inside Colombia, Varela relocated across the border into Venezuela, where he believed he could continue running his operation while staying beyond the reach of both Colombian and American law enforcement. Life in Venezuela came with its own complications. Varela reportedly had ongoing disputes with corrupt officials there who demanded increasing amounts of money in exchange for his protection, adding another layer of financial and political pressure to a man who was already being hunted by two governments. Meanwhile, Back in Colombia, the war with Montoya's Machos faction had left both sides exhausted, and in September of 2007, Montoya himself was finally captured by Colombian authorities, later facing extradition to the United States on drug trafficking charges. With his longtime rival out of the picture, Varela might have expected some measure of relief. Instead, the elimination of Montoya opened a new and far more dangerous chapter, one involving a jailed paramilitary commander named Carlos Mario Jimenez, known as Macaco, who wanted Varela's organization out of the city of Medellin and the surrounding Antioquia region entirely so that he could expand his own criminal territory without resistance. By early 2008, Varela was living under an assumed identity in Venezuela, carrying false documents under the name José Antonio Pérez Chacón and reportedly having undergone changes to his appearance to avoid recognition. On January 30th, 2008, Venezuelan authorities announced that a man found shot to death 2 days earlier inside a rented cabin at the Fresh Air Resort near the mountain city of Mérida had been confirmed through fingerprint analysis to be Wilber Varela. Investigators noted that his face did not closely resemble older photographs of him, supporting reports that he had undergone plastic surgery in an attempt to hide his identity while living in exile. Found dead alongside him was his personal bodyguard, a man known as Weimar Perez, nicknamed Grasoso. Cleaning staff at the resort discovered the two bodies, and witnesses reported that other men who had traveled to the cabin with Varela had already left the scene before authorities arrived. There was no shootout with police, no military raid, and no confrontation with a rival cartel. Varela had been killed quietly inside a vacation cabin by people who had gotten close enough to share the same roof with him without raising any alarm. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the betrayal. Colombian and American authorities concluded that Varela had been murdered by his own top lieutenants, the men he had built his entire organization around. Diego Pérez Henao, the military commander of Los Rastrojos, who Varela had personally placed in charge of his armed wing, was identified as one of the men responsible. Alongside him were the Calle Serna brothers, the same men who had once saved Varela's life after the 1996 ambush on the road to Rosso and had spent years rising through his organization on the strength of that loyalty. Investigators determined that the killing had been carried out at the request of Carlos Mario Jimenez, the jailed paramilitary boss who wanted Varela's faction to pull out of Medellin and Antioquia so his own operation could expand unopposed. In exchange for carrying out the killing, Pérez Henao and the Calle Serna brothers were allowed to keep control of the Rastrojos and its drug trafficking routes, effectively inheriting the empire of the man they had just helped kill. It was, in the most literal sense possible, a coup carried out from the inside, arranged by men who had spent years being trusted with Varela's safety and his business. No formal criminal trial in Colombia or the United States ever specifically charged anyone with the murder of Wilber Varela in a case built solely around that killing. Instead, the men connected to his death eventually faced justice through the much larger drug trafficking cases that had been building against them for years. Carlos Mario Jimenez, the man believed to have ordered the hit, was extradited to the United States in May of 2008, only months after Varela's death, though his extradition was carried out because he had failed to meet the terms of an earlier surrender agreement and had continued running criminal operations from behind bars, not because of any charge tied directly to Varela's killing. The men who had actually carried out the murder faced their own reckonings several years later. Diego Pérez Henao was captured by Venezuelan authorities in June of 2012 and extradited to the United States the following year, where he later admitted in court to helping manufacture and ship more than 80,000 kilograms of cocaine into the country between 1994 and 2008. a period that included the years he served. Separately, Colombian authorities also charged him with 66 homicides committed in the Valle del Cauca region. The Calle Serna brothers took a different path, voluntarily surrendering to American drug agents in 2012 rather than waiting to be captured, a decision that would ultimately work heavily in their favor. The sentences handed down to these men varied enormously depending on how they chose to cooperate with authorities. In August of 2014, a federal judge in Florida sentenced Diego Perez Henao to 30 years in prison, the equivalent of 360 months, along with an order to forfeit $1 million to the United States government. Prosecutors described him as one of the most powerful and prolific drug lords in recent Colombian history, responsible for smuggling more than 80 tons of cocaine into the country over more than a decade. The Calle Serna brothers received far lighter treatment in exchange for the information they provided to American investigators after their surrender. One of the brothers, Luis Enrique Calle Serna, spent 5 years in United States custody, cooperating with federal agents before a court in New York sentenced him to just 9 years in prison in February of 2017, a sentence that accounted for time he had already served and put him on track for release only a few years later. This wide gap between the 30-year sentence given to the man who resisted capture and the far shorter sentence given to the men who cooperated became a notable example of how extradition and plea deals could work very differently depending on whether a trafficker chose to fight the system or work with it. The fallout from Varela's murder reshaped the Colombian drug trade for years afterward. Los Rastrojos, the armed group Varela had built and named after himself, grew even larger and more powerful under the leadership of the men who had killed him, eventually becoming known as one of the most significant criminal organizations operating across Colombia, with reach extending into Ecuador and Venezuela as well. That expansion did not last. Between 2012 and 2013, the group's entire top leadership structure was either captured or surrendered within the span of about a year, and the loss of Perez Henao and the Calle Serna brothers effectively broke apart the organization's national reach, leaving smaller factions to fight over what remained of its territory against rival groups like the Urabeños. Varela's own family did not escape the violence that had defined his life either. His son from an earlier marriage, known as Varelita, was murdered in 2009, just 1 year after his father's death, a grim reminder of how deeply the cycle of killing had embedded itself into the world Varela had spent his life building. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Varela was betrayed quietly inside a rented cabin far from home, the next case on this list unfolds inside a prison built by the boss himself, where 2 of his own most trusted men were lured into a meeting and shot dead on his direct orders over a dispute involving $20 million in hidden cash. That boss was Pablo Escobar, and the men he killed had helped build the very empire he ruled. Case 4. Fernando Galeano, Medellin Cartel, 1992. Fernando Galeano was one of the trusted men who helped keep Pablo Escobar's drug empire running smoothly through some of its most dangerous years. He was not the public face of the Medellin cartel the way Escobar was, and his name never carried the same weight in newspapers or government files. Inside the organization, though, Galeano handled real money and real responsibility, moving cocaine and managing profits that made him one of the wealthier men connected to Escobar's network. In July of 1992, Galeano was murdered inside a private prison that Escobar himself had built, on the direct orders of the very boss he had spent years helping to enrich. The killing happened because Escobar's men discovered $20 million hidden away on property belonging to Galliano, money that Escobar believed should have already come to him. This case stands apart from most stories of cartel betrayal, because the man who ordered the killing was not a rival trying to seize power from the outside. He was the founder of the entire organization, sitting inside his own custom-built jail, using the very isolation meant to punish him as the perfect cover to eliminate a man he no longer trusted. To understand why Fernando Galliano ended up dead inside a prison, it helps to understand exactly what kind of prison it was. In June of 1991, after years of waging open war against the Colombian government through bombings and assassinations meant to fight extradition to the United States, Escobar agreed to surrender under a deal negotiated with the administration of President Cesar Gaviria. Colombia had just passed a new constitution that banned the extradition of Colombian citizens, and this single change gave Escobar the confidence to turn himself in, knowing he would never be shipped off to face American courts. As part of the surrender arrangement, Escobar was allowed to build the facility that would hold him, and what he built barely resembled a prison at all. Perched on a hillside overlooking the town of Envigado near Medellin, the compound became known as La Catedral, and it came equipped with a nightclub, a sauna, a waterfall, a soccer field, and even a small dollhouse built for his young daughter to play in when she visited. Escobar controlled who could enter and leave the property, including the guards assigned to watch him, and he continued to run the Medellin cartel from inside its walls almost exactly as he had while free. Fernando Galliano was one of several established traffickers operating within the wider network that made up the Medellin cartel, a term that described more of a loose alliance between independent operators than a single tightly run company. Men like Galliano and his close associate Gerardo Moncada, known as Kiko, ran their own smuggling operations, managed their own cocaine shipments into the United States, and built substantial personal fortunes doing so, all while still working within Escobar's broader orbit and paying into the organization's shared resources when required. This arrangement had worked for years because Escobar's authority as the most powerful and most feared trafficker in Colombia gave the entire network protection and access that none of the individual operators could have secured alone. Once Escobar was locked away inside La Catedral, even in relative comfort, his ability to personally oversee every corner of the business weakened, and men who had once quietly built their own wealth on the side began operating with a bit more independence than they had before. That independence became a problem the moment Escobar decided he needed more money to fund his defense, his family's lifestyle, and the network of lawyers and officials he continued to pay off from behind bars. He began charging other traffickers connected to the cartel what amounted to a personal tax, demanding payments that reportedly ranged from $200,000 up to a full $1 million from various members of the network. This new demand did not sit well with everyone, and it created quiet resentment among men who had spent years building their own operations only to be asked to hand over large sums simply because Escobar said so. In July of 1992, that resentment turned into something far more serious. Escobar's men searched a property connected to Fernando Galliano and found $20 million in cash hidden there, an enormous sum even by the standards of Colombia's cocaine trade at its peak. To Escobar, this discovery looked like exactly the kind of betrayal he could not tolerate. It suggested that Galliano had been hiding profits rather than contributing his fair share to the organization, and worse, that he had been doing it while Escobar sat locked away with limited ability to check on his own people. Rather than send men to confront Galliano at his own property, Escobar chose a different approach. He summoned both Galliano and his close associate Kiko Moncada to La Catedral for what was presented as an ordinary business meeting, the kind of face-to-face sit-down that had taken place countless times before between Escobar and the men who worked under him. Both men traveled to the prison, believing they were walking into a conversation about cartel finances, the same routine business they had conducted with Escobar for years. There was no reason for either of them to expect anything different this time. Escobar had built his reputation on personal relationships, favors, and loyalty, and both Galiano and Moncada had every reason to believe that whatever tension existed over money could be discussed and resolved the way it always had been in the past. That meeting never became a negotiation. According to multiple accounts of what happened inside La Catedral, Escobar had already decided the outcome before either man arrived, and he did not simply order the killing from a distance the way a boss might send hitmen to handle an outside enemy. Reporting on the incident indicates that Escobar personally took part in what happened to Galiano and Moncada once they were inside the compound, rather than remaining separate from the violence the way he often did with killings carried out on his behalf elsewhere in Colombia. Two of Escobar's own hitmen were involved in carrying out the actual killing of both men. There was no trial, no formal accusation presented to either man, and no opportunity for Galiano to explain the $20 million found on his property. He and Moncada, two men who had helped build significant pieces of Escobar's criminal empire, were killed inside the very prison Escobar had constructed for his own comfort, murdered on the word of the man they had trusted enough to walk into that meeting in the first place. Word of what had happened to Galiano and Moncada did not stay contained within the walls of La Catedral for long. Colombian officials became aware that two men connected to the cartel had been killed inside the facility, and the news created an immediate political problem for President Gaviria's government, which had already faced heavy criticism for allowing Escobar to build and control such a lavish private prison in the first place. Officials decided that Escobar needed to be moved to a standard, far less accommodating facility, where he would have none of the freedoms he had enjoyed at La Catedral. When authorities arrived to carry out that transfer in July of 1992, Escobar refused to go along with it. Rather than allow himself to be moved into a real prison where his control over the outside world would be sharply limited, Escobar and several of his men slipped away from the compound before the transfer could be enforced, disappearing into hiding and beginning what would become one of the largest manhunts in Colombian history. The killings of Galiano and Moncada set off consequences that went far beyond the immediate loss of two of Escobar's own men. Kiko Moncada's widow, a woman named Judy Moncada, did not accept her husband's death quietly. She swore revenge against Escobar and, along with her brother Jaime Mendoza and a former head of Escobar's own security team named Diego Murillo Bejarano, broke away entirely from the Medellin cartel's orbit. These former insiders, now driven by grief and a desire for payback, began working alongside Escobar's other enemies, including members of the rival Cali cartel, in an effort to bring him down once and for all. This growing coalition eventually formed into a vigilante group known as Los Pepes, an abbreviation of a Spanish phrase meaning those persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Los Pepes operated with a brutal mission of their own, hunting down Escobar's remaining associates, destroying his properties, and targeting members of his family, all while quietly coordinating with the Colombian government's official search block unit and American drug agents who were separately hunting Escobar through more conventional law enforcement channels. The murder of two of Escobar's own men inside his own prison had effectively created an army of new enemies from within his own former network, people who understood exactly how his organization worked because they had once been part of it themselves. Escobar spent the next several months evading capture, moving between hideouts across Medellin, while Los Pepes and the search block closed in from multiple directions at once. No court in Colombia, or anywhere else, ever held a formal trial specifically addressing the murders of Fernando Galiano and Gerardo Moncada. There were no charges filed, no witnesses called to testify, and no jury asked to weigh evidence about what happened inside La Catedral that day. The reason for this absence of any formal legal process was simple. Escobar was never captured alive to answer for what he had done, and the men who carried out the actual killing on his behalf were never publicly identified or prosecuted either. Whatever justice existed for Galiano and Moncada came not through a courtroom, but through the war their deaths helped ignite, a war that consumed Escobar's entire empire over the following year and a half. That war ended on December 2nd, 1993, the day after Escobar's 44th birthday, when Colombian special forces working with American intelligence support finally traced him to a modest, middle-class house in a residential neighborhood of Medellin. When officers moved in to make the arrest, gunfire broke out, and Escobar attempted to flee across the rooftop of the building. He was shot multiple times, including a fatal wound to the head, and died on that rooftop, bringing an end to more than 16 months of hiding that had begun the moment he escaped La Catedral rather than accept transfer to a real prison. Diego Murillo Bejarano, the former Escobar security chief who had helped form Los Pepes after the killing of his friend Kiko Moncada, went on to build his own criminal career in the years that followed, eventually becoming a powerful paramilitary commander in Colombia before he too was extradited to the United States in 2008 to face drug trafficking charges of his own. Judy Moncada, whose husband's murder had helped set the entire chain of events in motion, largely faded from public view once the war against Escobar concluded, her role in his downfall remembered mainly as a footnote in the larger story of how Colombia's most feared drug lord finally met his end. The killing of Fernando Galiano stands out among cases of cartel bosses turning on their own men, because in this instance, the man giving the order was not trying to steal power from someone above him or protect a fragile new position at the top. Escobar was already the undisputed leader of his entire criminal network, feared across Colombia and known around the world, and he still chose to have two of his own loyal earners killed over a dispute involving hidden money, using his own custom-built prison as the setting for the murder. The message this sent to everyone still connected to the Medellin cartel was impossible to misunderstand. No amount of past loyalty, personal friendship, or shared history in building the organization together would protect anyone if Escobar decided they had crossed him, and this reality applied even to the men who had helped make him one of the wealthiest criminals in the world in the first place. What Escobar likely never anticipated was that this single act of ruthlessness inside La Catedral would help assemble the exact coalition of enemies who would ultimately hunt him down and end his life just over a year later. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The other man killed alongside Galiano inside La Catedral that day, Kiko Moncada, ran an equally significant piece of the cartel's financial empire, and the specifics of his own rise inside the organization, along with the personal toll his death took on the people closest to him, reveal just how much was actually at stake inside those prison walls when Escobar decided both men needed to disappear. Case 5. Gerardo Kiko Moncada, Medellin Cartel, 1992. Gerardo Moncada, known to almost everyone in the Medellin underworld as Kiko, spent years building a reputation as one of the most capable operators inside Pablo Escobar's drug trafficking network. He was not one of the loud, violent figures who made headlines through bombings or assassinations. Moncada's value came from his ability to manage large sums of money and keep cocaine shipments moving smoothly, the kind of quiet, essential work that kept an organization the size of the Medellin cartel functioning day to day. When Escobar surrendered to Colombian authorities in 1991 and began serving his sentence inside a private prison he had built for himself, Moncada was one of the men left in charge of running the cartel's operations from the outside. In July of 1992, that trusted position ended in the same building where Escobar was supposed to be serving his punishment. Moncada was summoned to the prison, accused of stealing from the very man he had been loyally supporting, and killed on Escobar's orders inside the walls that were meant to hold Escobar himself, not the men working for him. To understand Moncada's death, it helps to understand the strange arrangement Escobar had negotiated for himself in 1991. After years of waging a violent campaign against the Colombian government to avoid being extradited to the United States, Escobar agreed to surrender once Colombia passed a new constitution banning the extradition of its own citizens. As part of the surrender deal, Escobar was allowed to design and help build the facility that would hold him. The result? A hillside compound near Medellin, known as La Catedral, offered him comforts that no ordinary prisoner could expect, including a soccer field, a bar, and guards he had personally chosen. While Escobar lived in relative comfort inside La Catedral, someone still needed to keep the actual drug business running on the outside, moving cocaine north into the United States and managing the enormous flow of cash the operation generated. Gerardo Moncada and his close associate, Fernando Galeano, were two of the men given that responsibility, continuing to run major pieces of the cartel's day-to-day trafficking operation, while Escobar stayed behind the walls he had built for himself. Running that business came with a cost that grew heavier over time. Escobar needed continuous funding to pay for his legal defense, support his family, and keep buying the loyalty of guards, lawyers, and government officials even while locked away. According to reporting on the cartel's internal finances during this period, Escobar began charging the other traffickers connected to his network what amounted to a personal tax, with individual payments reportedly ranging anywhere from $200,000 up to a full $1 million, depending on the person and the situation. Moncada and Galeano, who were among the most successful earners still active in the business, found themselves paying some of the largest sums into this arrangement. For a while, both men accepted these payments as simply the price of doing business under Escobar's protection, the same kind of tribute that had always flowed toward whoever sat at the top of the Medellin cartel. As the demands grew larger and Escobar's control from inside La Catedral became more erratic, resentment began building quietly among the men who were footing the bill for a boss they rarely saw in person anymore. That resentment turned deadly in July of 1992, when Escobar's men discovered $20 million in hidden cash connected to property belonging to Fernando Galeano. Because Moncada and Galeano operated so closely together, sharing responsibility for many of the same shipments and the same financial arrangements, the discovery immediately implicated Moncada as well in Escobar's eyes. To a man already suspicious about whether his own people were skimming money behind his back, a stash of that size looked like undeniable proof of betrayal. Escobar did not send anyone to investigate the matter quietly or ask for an explanation through an intermediary. Instead, he summoned both Moncada and Galeano directly to La Catedral, presenting it as an ordinary meeting between a boss and two of his top earners, the same kind of face-to-face conversation that had defined how business was conducted inside the Medellin cartel for years. Neither man had any reason to expect the meeting would end differently than the countless others they had already survived. Once Moncada and Galeano arrived inside La Catedral, the meeting turned into an accusation rather than a negotiation. Escobar confronted both men over the hidden money, and according to accounts of what happened next, he did not simply issue an order and step away, the way he often did when ordering violence against outside enemies. Two of Escobar's own hitmen carried out the killing of both men inside the compound, ending the lives of two of his most productive and financially valuable associates without any trial, any outside witnesses, or any real opportunity for either man to defend himself against the accusation. There was no gunfight, no ambush from a rival organization, and no soldier or police officer involved anywhere in what happened. The men responsible for Moncada's death were members of his own organization, acting on the direct word of the boss he had spent years enriching, inside a building that was supposed to represent his punishment rather than a place where he could still order executions of his own people. Word of what had happened inside La Catedral did not stay contained for long, and the political consequences arrived quickly. Colombian officials, already facing criticism over how comfortable Escobar's private prison had become, could not ignore reports that 2 men connected to the cartel had been murdered inside the facility. Authorities decided Escobar needed to be removed from La Catedral and placed in a standard, far more restrictive prison, where his ability to run outside operations and order further violence would be sharply limited. Before that transfer could be carried out in July of 1992, Escobar and several of his men escaped the compound rather than accept being moved, disappearing into hiding and setting off a massive manhunt across Colombia that would eventually last well over a year. The killing of his own trusted associate had directly triggered the chain of events that forced Escobar out of the comfortable arrangement he had built for himself and into a life spent constantly on the run. The damage from Moncada's death went far beyond the immediate political fallout inside Colombia's government. Diego Murillo Bejarano, who had served as the head of security for the Medellin cartel and had worked closely alongside men like Moncada for years, made the decision to break away from Escobar's organization entirely in the aftermath of the killings at La Catedral. This was a significant loss for Escobar. Murillo Bejarano understood the cartel's internal structure, its security arrangements, and the network of people connected to its operations from the inside, making him exactly the kind of defector capable of causing serious damage to Escobar's remaining organization. Around this same period, a paramilitary group known as Los Pepes, an abbreviation for a Spanish phrase meaning those persecuted by Pablo Escobar, began forming with the goal of hunting down Escobar and everyone still loyal to him. Los Pepes was primarily founded and led by brothers Carlos and Fidel Castaño, right-wing paramilitary commanders who had their own long-standing reasons to want Escobar dead, and the group received significant funding from the rival Cali cartel, which saw an opportunity to permanently eliminate its most dangerous competitor. Murillo Bejarano became one of the key figures connected to Los Pepes as the group carried out its campaign, bringing insider knowledge of the Medellin cartel's operations to a coalition that was rapidly closing in on Escobar from multiple directions at once. Los Pepes operated with methods every bit as brutal as anything Escobar himself had used over the years. The group hunted down and killed people connected to Escobar's network, ranging from his personal hitmen down to accountants, drivers, and other low-level associates who had nothing to do with ordering violence themselves. They also worked with elements of the Colombian National Police, particularly an elite unit known as the Search Block that had been formed specifically to track down Escobar, sharing intelligence that helped guide official law enforcement efforts, even as Los Pepes carried out its own extrajudicial killings in parallel. American drug enforcement agents operating in Colombia during this period were aware of the connections between Los Pepes and the police, and this cooperation, however uncomfortable it may have looked on paper, proved effective at steadily dismantling what remained of Escobar's support network throughout 1992 and into 1993. Each associate killed or captured made it harder for Escobar to move safely, communicate with the outside world, or access the money he needed to keep paying for protection. No court in Colombia or anywhere else ever held a trial specifically addressing the murder of Gerardo Moncada. The men who carried out the actual killing inside La Catedral were never publicly identified or prosecuted for that specific act, and Escobar himself was never formally charged with ordering it in any legal proceeding, since he remained a fugitive from the moment of his escape until the day he died. Whatever accountability existed for Moncada's death came not through any courtroom, but through the collapse of Escobar's own empire, a collapse that his decision to kill Moncada and Galiano had directly helped set into motion. The very men Escobar had trusted to keep his organization running while he sat inside La Catedral ended up producing, through their deaths, some of the most effective and determined enemies he would ever face. That collapse reached its final point on December 2nd, 1993, the day after Escobar turned 44 years old. Colombian security forces, working with technical support from the United States, tracked Escobar to a house in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellin after intercepting a phone call he made to his family. When officers moved in, Escobar attempted to escape across the rooftop and was shot and killed in the process, ending more than 16 months on the run that had begun the moment he fled La Catedral rather than accept transfer to a real prison. The empire Escobar had built through decades of violence and corruption did not survive him for long in its original form. The Medellin cartel fractured into smaller pieces almost immediately, and control of Colombia's cocaine trade shifted toward the Cali cartel, the very organization that had helped fund the campaign against Escobar in the first place. Diego Murillo Bejarano's own path, after breaking away from Escobar, took him deep into Colombia's broader civil conflict. In the years following Escobar's death, he became a significant leader within the paramilitary movement that grew out of groups like Los Pepes, eventually rising to a senior position inside the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a nationwide paramilitary alliance that fought against leftist guerrilla groups while also remaining deeply involved in drug trafficking. Murillo Bejarano, better known by that point as Don Berna, effectively took over much of Medellin's underworld in the years after Escobar's death, controlling large parts of the city's drug trade and criminal enterprise under the cover of his paramilitary role. He eventually reached an agreement with the Colombian government during a broader demobilization process for paramilitary groups, only to later face extradition to the United States, where he was made to answer for drug trafficking charges tied to the same criminal career that had begun decades earlier as Escobar's own head of security. The killing of Gerardo Moncada inside La Catedral remains one of the clearest examples of how a boss's own paranoia and greed can destroy the very foundation holding an organization together. Escobar was not eliminating a rival trying to seize power from him, and he was not defending himself against an outside threat. He was killing one of his own most valuable and loyal earners over a financial dispute, using a facility built for his own comfort as the setting for the murder. And in doing so, he created exactly the kind of determined, well-informed enemies capable of ending his life little more than a year later. Moncada spent years helping build the wealth and power that made Escobar one of the most feared criminals in modern history, and his reward for that loyalty was a summons to a private prison where the man he had helped enrich decided he was more valuable dead than alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of how Escobar's own paranoia turned his most trusted earners into the architects of his downfall does not end with Moncada and Galiano. Elsewhere in Colombia, a similar pattern of suspicion and betrayal was already playing out inside a rival organization, where a Norte del Valle cartel lieutenant named Efraín Hernández, known as Don Efra, was about to be killed by his own employee After his boss began to suspect, he was ready to talk to American drug agents. Case 6. Efrain. Don Efra Hernandez Ramirez. Norte del Valle Cartel, known 1996. Efrain Hernandez Ramirez, known throughout the Colombian underworld as Don Efra, held one of the most powerful positions inside the Norte del Valle Cartel during the mid-1990s, serving as second-in-command under the organization's top boss, Orlando Henao Montoya. Hernandez had built substantial personal wealth through his role in the cartel, and by most accounts, he was seen as one of the most trusted men close to Henao, a partner who had helped run the day-to-day business of moving cocaine out of Colombia and into the United States. In November of 1996, that trust ended with a bullet fired inside a Bogotá shopping center by a man who worked directly for Hernandez himself. The order to kill him did not come from a rival organization or from any outside enemy. It came from his own boss and partner, Orlando Henao, who had grown convinced that Hernandez was preparing to cooperate with American authorities and could no longer be trusted to stay quiet. The Norte del Valle Cartel emerged during one of the most unstable periods in the history of Colombia's drug trade. Throughout the mid-1990s, the country's two dominant trafficking organizations, the Medellin Cartel and the Cali Cartel, both collapsed within a few years of each other. Pablo Escobar was killed in December of 1993, and the leaders of the Cali Cartel were arrested and negotiated surrenders throughout 1995 and 1996, leaving behind a massive vacuum in Colombia's cocaine trade. Out of that vacuum rose a new generation of traffickers based in the northern part of Valle del Cauca province, men who had often worked as enforcers, security chiefs, or mid-level operators for the older cartels before stepping into leadership roles of their own. Orlando Henao Montoya was one of these men, a former policeman who had risen through the ranks of the collapsing Cali network before establishing himself as one of the most feared bosses in this new generation of traffickers. Efrain Hernandez became one of his closest and most important partners, trusted with responsibilities that placed him near the very top of the organization's hierarchy. The environment surrounding the Norte del Valle Cartel during this period was defined by a specific kind of fear that had not existed in quite the same way during the earlier reign of Escobar or the Cali bosses. As American drug enforcement agencies pushed harder than ever for the extradition of Colombian traffickers to face trial in the United States, the incentive for any given cartel figure to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence or protection grew stronger by the year. This created a climate of intense paranoia among the men running these organizations, since a single trusted partner deciding to turn informant could expose an entire network built over years or even decades. Orlando Henao himself was reportedly consumed by this fear, worried constantly that his own closest associates might eventually betray him to the DEA in exchange for leniency from American prosecutors. This paranoia did not stay confined to abstract worry. It shaped the decisions Henao made about the people closest to him, including the man who had spent years serving as his second-in-command. By 1996, Henao had become convinced that Efrain Hernandez represented exactly this kind of threat. Whether this suspicion grew from specific evidence, from rumors circulating within the cartel's inner circle, or simply from the general climate of distrust that had settled over the organization, the effect was the same. Henao decided that Hernandez needed to be eliminated before he could act on any potential cooperation with American authorities. Rather than move against Hernandez directly through his own personal enforcers, Henao took a more calculated approach, one that would make the killing look like an unrelated dispute rather than an execution ordered from within the cartel's own leadership. He turned to a man named Fernando Cifuentes, who worked as an employee under Hernandez himself, and arranged for Cifuentes to carry out the killing on his behalf. Using a man who worked directly for the intended target gave Henao several advantages at once. Cifuentes had regular, ordinary access to Hernandez, meaning he could get close enough to carry out the killing without raising suspicion beforehand the way an outside hitman might. It also meant that if questions were ever asked about who might have wanted Hernandez dead, the immediate assumption would point towards some internal dispute within Hernandez's own business dealings rather than toward Henao and the cartel's broader leadership. According to accounts of what happened, the cover story that emerged around the killing centered on a disagreement over the accounting for a shipment of cocaine that had never arrived at its intended destination, the kind of ordinary business dispute that happened constantly in the drug trade and would not necessarily draw attention to a deeper motive. This framing served Henao's purposes perfectly, allowing the true reason behind the killing, the fear that Hernandez might become an informant, to remain hidden behind what looked like a routine dispute over money and missing product. On November 6, 1996, Fernando Cifuentes shot and killed Efraín Hernandez inside a shopping center in Bogotá. The setting itself was notable for how ordinary and public it was, rather than being killed in a secluded location or during some private cartel meeting. Hernandez died in a place filled with everyday shoppers going about their normal business, adding to the confusion that surrounded the killing in its immediate aftermath. Witnesses and initial reports treated the incident as exactly what it had been designed to look like: a violent dispute connected to Hernandez's business dealings rather than an assassination ordered by his own partner and boss. There was no warning given to Hernandez, no confrontation that allowed him to explain himself or negotiate his way out of the situation the way cartel disputes sometimes played out through mediation. He was simply shot dead in public by a man who had spent time working for him, acting on instructions from someone Hernandez likely considered one of his closest allies in the organization. The full truth behind the killing did not stay completely hidden for long, at least not within the closed circles of the Colombian underworld that tracked these kinds of internal cartel movements closely. Once it became understood that Cifuentes had acted on Henao's orders rather than out of some personal grievance connected to the missing cocaine shipment, Henao faced a new problem. Cifuentes now represented a loose end, a man who knew exactly what had really happened and why, and who could potentially expose Henao's role in the killing if he ever found himself under pressure from authorities or rival factions within the cartel. Henao resolved this problem the same way he had resolved the original issue with Hernandez, by having Cifuentes killed as well. The task of eliminating Cifuentes fell to Wilber Varela, Henao's chief hitman and the head of his personal security and enforcement operations, the same man who would later go on to lead his own faction of the Norte del Valle cartel after Henao's own death. Varela's killing of Cifuentes closed the loop on the entire episode, ensuring that the only man who could directly connect Henao to the ordered killing of his own second-in-command would never be able to testify to that fact. No formal criminal trial in Colombia ever specifically addressed the murder of Efraín Hernandez as an internal cartel execution ordered by Orlando Henao. This lack of a legal proceeding was not an accident or a failure of investigation so much as a direct result of how carefully the killing had been arranged and covered up from the start. With the cover story about the missing cocaine shipment providing a plausible alternative explanation, and with Fernando Cifuentes, the one man who could have confirmed the true motive behind the killing, murdered shortly afterward to eliminate any risk of exposure, there was no clear path for Colombian prosecutors to build a case connecting Hernandez's death directly to Henao's orders. Henao himself remained free and continued running his growing criminal empire for nearly another year, before eventually surrendering to Colombian authorities in September of 1997 on separate charges related to illicit enrichment and money laundering, a surrender that had nothing to do with the killing of his own former partner. Much of what is known today about the internal workings of the Norte del Valle cartel during this period, including the details surrounding Hernandez's death, comes from testimony and accounts provided years later by former cartel insiders who eventually cooperated with authorities or wrote about their experiences after leaving the criminal world behind. One notable example is Andrés López López, a former Norte del Valle cartel associate who later wrote a book detailing the organization's internal history, providing outside observers with a much clearer picture of how power actually functioned inside a criminal network that had otherwise operated with considerable secrecy. Without these kinds of insider accounts emerging after the fact, much of the true story behind killings like the one that ended Hernandez's life might never have become clear to anyone outside the cartel's own closed circle of leadership. The absence of any formal trial or sentence for Hernandez's murder meant that the only real consequence connected to his death came through the same violent internal logic that had caused it in the first place. Fernando Cifuentes paid for carrying out the killing with his own life just a short time later, eliminated not as punishment handed down by any court, but simply as a practical measure to protect Orlando Henao from exposure. This pattern, in which the person who carried out an internal execution was themselves killed shortly afterward to erase any trace of the true chain of command, was not unique to this single case. It reflected a broader culture inside the Norte del Valle cartel, where loyalty offered no real protection and where surviving one act of violence often meant becoming a liability that needed to be eliminated in turn. Orlando Henao's own fate followed this same pattern within just 2 years of ordering Hernandez's death. After surrendering to authorities in 1997, Henao continued directing cartel business from behind bars, including ordering the 1998 killing of a rival Cali cartel figure named Pacho Herrera inside a Colombian prison. That killing set off its own chain of retaliation, and in November of 1998, Henao was murdered inside his own prison cell by a relative of the man he had just had killed, who had smuggled weapons into the facility specifically to carry out the act of revenge. The very culture of internal violence and suspicion that Henao had used to eliminate Efrain Hernandez 2 years earlier ultimately consumed Henao himself, ending his life in almost exactly the same manner, killed from within by someone connected to the very network of alliances and rivalries he had spent years navigating. With Henao gone, the Norte del Valle cartel splintered into rival factions that would go on to fight one of the bloodiest internal wars in the history of Colombian organized crime, a war that would eventually consume the very men who had once served as Henao's most loyal enforcers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pattern seen throughout the Norte del Valle cartel, where suspicion of betrayal led bosses to eliminate their own most trusted partners, using the very people closest to those partners, was not confined to Colombia. Across the border in Mexico, a nearly identical culture of paranoia and internal violence was taking hold inside a newly formed paramilitary group of ex-soldiers known as Los Zetas, where the death of one of its founding commanders during what officials called a shootout would later be described by his own comrades as a carefully arranged execution ordered from within the group's own leadership. Case 7. Efrain Teodoro Torres, Z14, Los Zetas, 2007. Efrain Teodoro Torres was known across northern Mexico by several names, including El Efra, La Chispa, and the radio code that would follow him for the rest of his life, Z14. He was one of the founding members of Los Zetas, the paramilitary group of former Mexican army soldiers that began as the private enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel before growing into one of the most violent criminal organizations in the country's history. By the time of his death on March 3, 2007, Torres had risen to become the second highest-ranking member of Los Zetas, trusted with major responsibilities across the organization's territory. What makes his case different from most of the others on this list is that there is no single agreed-upon version of what actually happened to him. Mexican officials described his death as the result of a firefight during a police raid on an illegal horse race. Other reports, including information gathered directly from police intelligence sources, suggested the shooting was actually an assassination attempt targeting a different Zetas commander that Torres simply happened to be caught in the middle of. Years later, a rival commander from inside his own organization publicly accused a fellow Zetas leader of orchestrating Torres's death as a deliberate act of betrayal. All three explanations exist side by side to this day, and no court has ever settled which one is true. Torres joined the Mexican army in the middle of 1991, following a path that many young men from working-class backgrounds in Mexico took to find steady employment and a sense of purpose. In 1996, before he ever considered a life of crime, Torres received counter-narcotics training at the School of the Americas, a United States military training program that had trained soldiers from across Latin America for decades. 2 years later, in September of 1998, Torres deserted the army after 7 years of service and joined the ranks of the Gulf Cartel, recruited by the organization's leader at the time, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén. Torres became one of the founding members of the group of former soldiers that Cárdenas assembled as his private paramilitary wing, a group that would come to be known as Los Zetas because its earliest members took on numbers as their radio codes and aliases. Torres received the number 14, marking him as one of the original group of deserters who built the organization from nothing into one of the most feared forces in Mexican organized crime. Within Los Zetas, Torres developed a reputation that set him apart, even among a group of men already known for extreme violence. According to accounts of his behavior and personality, Torres embodied what has been described as a reckless cowboy mentality, drinking heavily, developing a serious cocaine habit, and indulging a passion for betting on horse races that would eventually place him directly in the setting where his life ended. In January of 2004, Torres commanded an armed assault on a prison in the city of Apatzingan, successfully freeing more than 25 inmates in a single coordinated operation, a mission that demonstrated both his willingness to take dramatic risks and his ability to plan and execute complex paramilitary-style attacks. After the founder of Los Zetas, Arturo Guzmán de Sena, was killed by the Mexican army in November of 2002, leadership passed to Heriberto Lascano, and Torres rose alongside him to become the group's second in command, participating in strategic decisions about territorial expansion and the organization's growing conflicts with rival cartels. By 2007, the situation inside both the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas had grown increasingly unstable. Ociel Cárdenas, the man who had originally built the alliance between the two organizations, had been extradited to the United States that same year to face trial after his 2003 capture by the Mexican military. With Cárdenas no longer able to exercise direct control from behind bars the way he once had, tension began building between Heriberto Lascano, who led Los Zetas, and Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez, who was emerging as the new leader of the Gulf Cartel proper. Both men wanted overall supremacy over the combined criminal enterprise that Cárdenas had once controlled, and this growing rivalry created an atmosphere of suspicion throughout the entire organization, one where loyalty could shift quickly, and where commanders needed to watch not only for threats from rival cartels, but also from within their own ranks. It was into this atmosphere of rising internal tension that Torres, a man already known for his reckless habits, walked into a gathering that would end his life. On March 3, 2007, several members of Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel organized a horse race at a ranch known as El Villarin in the state of Veracruz. 2 horses competed, while spectators drank, gambled, and shouted encouragement, with bets on the outcome reportedly reaching $2 million, an enormous sum that reflected how much wealth and status these underworld gatherings represented for the men involved. As the 2 horses crossed the finish line in what witnesses described as an extremely close race, and before anyone could confirm the winner through a photo finish, gunfire suddenly broke out among the crowd of drug traffickers gathered at the ranch. According to police intelligence gathered afterward, the eruption of violence had actually been arranged as cover for an assassination attempt targeting Heriberto Lazcano, the top leader of Los Zetas and a close associate of Torres, who was also present at the event. As the shooting escalated, the assembled figures from Mexico's criminal underworld scattered in every direction, some fleeing in their vehicles and others taking cover behind the stands built around the makeshift racetrack. When the chaos ended, Torres and another man lay dead from gunshot wounds, and 2 additional people had been injured. Torres had reportedly brought 18 armed men with him to the event, a number that reflected both his own high status within the organization and the level of security that had become necessary for senior Zetas commanders, even at a supposedly recreational gathering among allies. The confusion surrounding what actually caused the shooting extended even to the basic question of who had died. Mexican authorities did not immediately confirm that one of the men killed at the ranch was Efrain Teodoro Torres. Instead, the body was initially identified under a different name, Roberto Carlos Carmona Gasparin, and it took nearly 6 months of investigation before Mexico's Attorney General's office officially confirmed that the man who had died at Millennium Hospital following the shooting was in fact the Zetas commander, known as Z-14. This delay reflected both the difficulty authorities faced in confirming the identities of high-level cartel figures who often lived and traveled under false names, and the broader culture of secrecy that surrounded the inner workings of an organization built by soldiers trained specifically in counterinsurgency and evasion tactics. Even after Torres's death and burial, the story surrounding him did not end quietly. According to records connected to his case, Torres's own gunmen broke into the cemetery where he had been laid to rest on the very same night of his burial and physically removed his body from the grave. This unusual act, carried out by men who had served under him, suggests that even in death, Torres remained a figure important enough within Los Zetas that his own organization wanted control over what happened to his remains, whether out of loyalty, superstition, or a desire to prevent authorities from having any further access to physical evidence connected to his death. No public explanation has ever definitively established exactly why his body was taken or where it was ultimately relocated, adding one more layer of mystery to a case that already lacked a clear and settled account of what had happened at the horse race itself. For several years after Torres's death, the competing explanations for the shooting circulated without any single version gaining full acceptance. Official statements attributed to Veracruz state authorities described the incident as the result of federal security forces raiding an unauthorized horse racing operation, a version of events that fit a pattern of government messaging that often emphasized law enforcement action over admissions of uncontrolled cartel violence. This account sat uneasily alongside the version drawn from police intelligence sources describing the shooting as a targeted assassination attempt against Lazcano, that Torres was simply unfortunate enough to be caught inside. Neither of these versions pointed toward a deliberate, planned betrayal from within Los Zetas itself. That changed in 2012, 5 years after Torres's death, when Los Zetas experienced a violent split between two of its most powerful remaining commanders. By the middle of 2012, Heriberto Lazcano and Miguel Ángel Treviño Morales, known as Z40, had become locked in a bitter power struggle for control of Los Zetas, with each accusing the other of betrayal and disloyalty. A regional commander named Iván Velázquez Caballero, known as El Taliban, aligned himself against Treviño during this conflict and began publicly accusing him of a long pattern of betraying fellow Zetas commanders over the years, setting up their arrests or their deaths in order to eliminate rivals and consolidate his own power within the organization. Among the accusations El Taliban made was a claim that Treviño had been responsible for betraying Efraín Teodoro Torres back in 2007, orchestrating his death at the horse race rather than the shooting being either a random cartel dispute or the result of a genuine confrontation with federal authorities. El Taliban extended similar accusations to cover the deaths and arrests of several other prominent Zetas figures over the years, including Jaime González Durán, Jesús Enrique Rejón Aguilar, Raúl Lucio Hernández Lechuga, and even Arturo Guzmán de Sena, the very founder of Los Zetas, who had been killed by the Mexican army back in 2002. These accusations, delivered through public banners hung in cities across northern Mexico and through videos posted online, painted Treviño as a man willing to eliminate his own colleagues, one by one, on his path to the top of the organization. No court of law has ever formally proven any of these competing explanations for Torres's death, and the accusations made against Treviño in 2012 came from a rival commander locked in his own violent struggle for power. Someone with an obvious motive to portray Treviño in the worst possible light, regardless of what had actually happened at the horse race 5 years earlier. Organizations that study organized crime in Mexico have noted that the evidence behind these specific claims largely consisted of the public banners and statements made during the 2012 conflict, rather than any independently verified investigation, meaning the accusation against Treviño remains an allegation made by an interested party rather than an established historical fact. What is clear is that the internal culture of Los Zetas by this point had become one where such accusations were entirely plausible to those inside the organization, a group whose entire history had been built on soldiers turning against their own government and where commanders regularly turned against each other in the pursuit of greater power and territory. Iván Velázquez Caballero, the man who made the public accusations against Treviño, did not survive his own conflict with his rival for very long. Mexican Marines captured him in September of 2012 in the state of San Luis Potosí, ending his ability to continue the public campaign against Treviño's leadership. With El Taliban removed from the picture, Treviño consolidated his position within Los Zetas, and when Heriberto Lazcano was killed by Mexican Marines in October of 2012, Treviño rose to become the top leader of the entire organization, the same position that had once belonged to the men he stood accused of betraying over the preceding decade. Treviño's own reign at the top of Los Zetas did not last much longer than those of his predecessors. Mexican Marines captured him in July of 2013 near the town of Anahuac in Nuevo León, ending his time as the organization's leader and beginning a legal saga that would stretch on for more than a decade inside Mexico's court system. For over 10 years following his 2013 capture, Treviño remained in Mexican custody, while the United States repeatedly sought his extradition to face charges connected to drug trafficking and a long list of killings, including conspiracies to order attacks against rival cartel members, members of his own criminal organization, Mexican police officers, and Mexican soldiers spanning from 2004 through the time of his arrest in 2013. Mexican courts and legal challenges filed by his own defense team delayed that extradition for years, with Trevino transferred between more than a dozen different prison facilities across Mexico during that time. Finally, on February 27, 2025, Trevino and his brother Omar, who had also risen to lead Los Zetas after Miguel's capture before being arrested himself, were among 29 cartel figures handed over to American custody as part of one of the largest transfers of drug trafficking suspects in the history of relations between the two countries. Trevino is currently being held in the United States, facing charges of drug trafficking, weapons possession, and money laundering that could result in a life sentence, with his trial scheduled for the middle of 2026. The story of Efrain Teodoro Torres stands as a reminder that not every case of internal betrayal inside a criminal organization comes with a clear, agreed-upon explanation. Whether he died as collateral damage in an attempt to kill his close associate Lazcano, in a confrontation with government forces during an illegal gambling event, or as the deliberate target of a betrayal orchestrated by a fellow commander who would later rise to lead the entire organization, the truth remains locked inside an organization built from the very beginning on secrecy, violence, and the constant threat of betrayal from within. What is certain is that the man accused of orchestrating his death, Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, spent the years after Torres's killing rising steadily through the ranks of Los Zetas before eventually reaching the very top of the organization, a climb that several of his own former colleagues insisted was built on the bodies of the men who had once stood above him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pattern of a trusted lieutenant clearing his own path to power by eliminating the men around him did not stay confined to Mexico's paramilitary cartels. In Mexico's Beltran Leyva organization, a similar dynamic played out just 2 years after Torres's death, when a trusted right-hand man was captured by a rival cartel and pressured into giving up the exact location of his own boss, setting in motion a chain of events that ended with 200 Mexican Marines storming an apartment building in Cuernavaca. Case 8. Arturo Beltran Leyva. Beltran Leyva Organization, 2009. Arturo Beltran Leyva called himself El Jefe de Jefes, meaning the boss of bosses. And for a brief period in the late 2000s, he genuinely lived up to that title, running one of the most powerful and corrupt drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Beltran Leyva had spent years as a trusted security chief and underboss for the Sinaloa cartel before breaking away with his own brothers to form an independent operation. His downfall came not through a single dramatic act of betrayal carried out by one man, but through a slow collapse of loyalty inside his own organization, as protected witnesses, corrupt police officers on his own payroll, and paid informants gradually handed Mexican and American authorities the information they needed to track him down. On December 16, 2009, that information finally led 200 Mexican Marines to an apartment building in Cuernavaca, where Beltran Leyva died in a lengthy shootout that ended his reign as one of Mexico's most feared drug lords. Beltran Leyva was born on September 27, 1961, and raised in Badiraguato, a municipality in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, known for producing an outsized number of the country's most notorious drug traffickers, including Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known as El Chapo. As the oldest of 5 brothers, Arturo naturally assumed a leadership role within his family's growing involvement in the drug trade during the 1980s, a period when several major Colombian cartels were beginning to weaken and Mexican traffickers found new opportunities to expand their own operations, moving cocaine north into the United States. The Beltran-Leyva family's connection to El Chapo ran deep, extending beyond simple business partnership into something closer to an extended family alliance. And when Guzman was jailed in the early 1990s, the Beltran-Leyva brothers helped keep his operations running and reportedly assisted him with the 2001 prison escape that made him one of the most wanted men in the world. In 2002, Arturo Beltran-Leyva, along with El Chapo, Ismael Zambada Garcia, and Juan José Esparragosa Moreno, formalized an alliance sometimes referred to as the Federation, which brought together several of Mexico's most powerful trafficking networks under a loose but effective partnership. Within this arrangement, Arturo and his brothers, Alfredo, Carlos, and Hector, functioned as underbosses and security chiefs for the broader Sinaloa cartel structure, tasked with protecting shared interests and fighting off encroachment from rival organizations like the Gulf Cartel. Arturo built his own personal enforcement unit known as the Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, and other groups operating under the Beltran-Leyva umbrella included a unit called Los Pelones, led by a Texas-born operative named Edgar Valdez Villarreal, who went by the nickname La Barbie, and another group known as Los Negros, commanded by a former police detective. This layered security structure reflected how seriously the Beltran-Leyva brothers took the business of protecting their operations, building a private army capable of matching the violence of any rival organization they might face. For years, this arrangement functioned well, with the Beltran-Leyva brothers growing wealthier and more powerful while remaining formally aligned with Guzman and the broader Sinaloa network. That alliance shattered on January 21, 2008, when Mexican military forces arrested Alfredo Beltran-Leyva, known as El Mochomo, as he drove through the streets of Culiacan, Sinaloa, with his entourage. Arturo and his remaining brothers became convinced that Guzman himself had betrayed Alfredo to the authorities in order to consolidate power within the Sinaloa cartel, a suspicion that permanently ended the partnership between the two families. The Beltran-Leyva brothers broke away entirely, forming their own independent organization and forging new alliances with the Gulf Cartel and its enforcement wing, Los Zetas, groups that had previously been considered bitter enemies of the Sinaloa network. War broke out almost immediately between the newly independent Beltran-Leyva organization and their former partners. Only months after Alfredo's arrest, gunmen believed to be working for the Beltran-Leyva brothers killed Edgar Guzman, one of El Chapo's own sons, as he left a shopping center in Sinaloa. An attack that ignited a wave of violence across the state that kept residents indoors after dark for much of that year. By 2008, Arturo Beltran-Leyva had built a level of corruption inside Mexico's own government that went far beyond simple bribery of local police officers. His brother Alfredo's influence, which continued even from behind bars, had reached deep into the office of Mexico's Attorney General, with Noé Ramírez Mandujano, the head of the country's top organized crime investigative unit, known as CIEDO, reportedly receiving $450,000 a month to tip off the organization about upcoming law enforcement operations against them. This level of infiltration meant that for a significant period, the Beltran-Leyva organization often knew in advance when authorities were planning to move against them, giving Arturo a degree of protection that made him extraordinarily difficult to track. In July of 2009, a federal grand jury in New York issued an indictment against both Arturo and his brother Hector, describing a large-scale narcotics transportation network that used land, air, and sea routes to move drugs into the United States, supported by networks of corrupt police and political contacts, and enforced by hired killers responsible for hundreds of murders, kidnappings, and acts of torture connected to the organization's drug debts. Despite this deep infiltration of Mexican institutions, cracks in Beltran Leyva's protection began appearing throughout 2009 as American and Mexican authorities worked together more closely than ever before to dismantle his network from the inside. One especially damaging blow came through a Beltran Leyva operative who authorities gave the code name Maria Fernanda after the individual became a protected witness cooperating with investigators. According to reporting on the case, this informant provided authorities with the exact locations of numerous safe houses connected to the organization, along with detailed information about how the cartel actually operated day to day. This single source of information led directly to the arrest of nearly 50 people connected to the Beltran Leyva organization, including corrupt police officers and hired gunmen who had been on the cartel's payroll. By the final months of 2009, the pressure on Arturo's inner circle had grown so intense that, according to investigative reporting on the case, even his closest confidants had grown reluctant to be seen anywhere near him, aware that doing so now carried a serious risk of being swept up in the widening net closing around their boss. On December 11, 2009, a special forces team located Beltran Leyva at a Christmas party he was hosting at a house in Tepoztlan, a town in the state of Morelos, bordering the resort city of Cuernavaca. The party was a lavish affair, featuring performances by the singer Ramón Ayala and the group Los Cadetes de Linares, along with more than 20 women hired for entertainment. When authorities raided the property, a firefight broke out, and Beltran Leyva managed to escape along with his brother Héctor, though Arturo was reportedly wounded during the confrontation. Authorities recovered 16 assault rifles from the scene, along with cash and ammunition, and detained several people connected to the party, but the organization's top leader had once again slipped away. In the days that followed, United States intelligence agencies picked up his trail again, discovering that Beltran Leyva was hiding in a luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca while reportedly receiving medical attention for the gunshot wound he had suffered during the earlier raid. On December 16, 2009, Mexican authorities launched a much larger operation against the location where Beltran Leyva was hiding. Roughly 200 Mexican Marines surrounded the apartment complex, supported by 2 Navy helicopters that allowed additional troops to rappel directly onto the property, and 2 small army tanks positioned to reinforce the perimeter. Before launching the assault, authorities quietly evacuated other residents from the building to reduce the risk of civilian casualties during what everyone involved understood would likely become a serious firefight. Beltran Leyva's gunmen responded with intense resistance, reportedly using approximately 20 fragmentation grenades in an effort to keep the advancing Marines from breaching their position. The confrontation lasted around 90 minutes, and when it ended, Arturo Beltran Leyva was dead alongside several of his bodyguards, with one additional gunman reportedly taking his own life rather than being captured. Among the items recovered from the scene were tens of thousands of dollars in cash, several assault rifles, and a number of religious medallions and scapulars, small items of personal devotion that Beltran Leyva had apparently kept close, even during his final stand. The operation came at a real cost for the Mexican Navy as well. A member of the Marine Special Forces unit named Melquisedec Angulo Cordova was killed during the confrontation with Beltran Leyva's gunmen, and he was given a hero's burial with full military honors on December 21, 2009, just days after the raid that ended one of the most significant manhunts in the history of Mexico's war against organized crime. What happened next revealed just how far the Beltran Leyva organization was willing to go to send a message about the consequences of cooperating with the government's efforts against them. The very next day, while mourners were gathered for a candlelight wake, honoring the fallen Marine, gunmen believed to be connected to the cartel entered the family's home in the southern state of Tabasco and murdered several of Angulo Cordova's relatives, including his mother, brother, aunt, and sister. This attack on an entirely innocent family shocked a country that had already grown accustomed to extraordinary levels of drug-related violence, and it stood as a brutal final act of vengeance from an organization that had just lost its most powerful leader. No trial was ever held for Arturo Beltran Leyva himself, since he died during the raid that finally caught up with him rather than being taken into custody. His brothers and closest associates, however, faced their own reckonings in the years that followed. Alfredo, already in custody since his January 2008 arrest, eventually stood trial and was sentenced in connection with his role running major portions of the organization's trafficking network. Carlos Beltran Leyva was arrested shortly after Arturo's death, removing another senior member of the family from the organization's already thinning leadership. Sergio Villarreal Barragan, known as El Grande, who had served as one of the top security officials for the brothers, was captured by Mexican authorities in September of 2010. Edgar Valdez Villarreal, the Texas-born commander of the Pelones Enforcement Unit, was captured by Mexican federal police in August of 2010 following a lengthy manhunt, and he was later extradited to the United States, where he eventually pleaded guilty and cooperated extensively with American prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing investigators with detailed information about the inner workings of the organization he had once helped protect. Héctor Beltran Leyva, known within the organization as El Ingeniero because of his more businesslike demeanor and preference for suits over the flashier style favored by his late brother Arturo, assumed leadership of what remained of the organization after 2009. Héctor managed to avoid capture for several more years, eventually being arrested without incident in October of 2014, while dining at a seafood restaurant in the tourist town of San Miguel de Allende, a location favored by retired American expatriates and far removed from the violence typically associated with cartel operations. Other figures connected to the organization's remnants continued facing arrests and violent ends for years afterward, including Alfredo Beltran Guzman, known as El Mochomito, who was captured in December of 2016, and Juan Francisco Patron Sanchez, known as H2, who took over leadership after Héctor's arrest before being killed in a shootout with Mexican Marines in February of 2017. Piece by piece, the organization that Arturo Beltran Leyva had once run with the confidence to call himself the boss of bosses was dismantled through arrests, extraditions, and further internal violence over the following decade. The story of Arturo Beltran Leyva's downfall stands as a clear example of how even a criminal organization built on deep corruption and infiltration of government institutions can be brought down from within, not through a single traitor delivering one fatal piece of information, but through a slow accumulation of betrayals from protected witnesses, flipped police officers, and paid informants who each contributed a piece of the puzzle that eventually located him. The revenge killing of an innocent Marine's family in the days after his death showed exactly how far his organization was willing to go to punish anyone connected to bringing him down, yet that brutality did nothing to stop the organization's continued collapse in the years that followed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Beltran Leyva's downfall took months of patient intelligence gathering from multiple informants working separately, the next case on this list moves the story from Mexico's drug war to the streets of New York City, where a Bonanno crime family boss was betrayed in an instant by the two bodyguards standing directly beside him, men who sold him out for a promotion before he had even finished his lunch. Case 9. Carmine Galante, Bonanno crime family, 1979. Carmine Galante spent most of his adult life with a cigar clenched between his teeth, a habit so constant that it earned him the nickname Lilo, taken from Italian slang for a small stubby cigar, along with the simpler nickname most people used, the cigar. By 1979, Galante had risen to become the de facto boss of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 major organized crime families that controlled much of New York City's underworld. He had built a reputation over decades as one of the most violent and effective operators in the American mafia, with law enforcement officials accusing him of involvement in as many as 100 murders across his long criminal career. On July 12, 1979, Galante was gunned down while eating lunch on the patio of a Brooklyn restaurant, killed in an attack made possible by the 2 men sitting closest to him at the table, his own personal bodyguards, who had secretly agreed to help set him up in exchange for a promotion inside the very organization they were supposed to be protecting him within. Galante was born on February 21, 1910, in a tenement building in the East Harlem section of Manhattan, the son of Sicilian immigrants who had come to the United States in 1906. His father had worked as a fisherman back in Sicily before settling into a very different life in New York. From an early age, Galante showed little interest in staying out of trouble, getting sent to reform school by the time he was 10 years old, and forming his own juvenile street gang on the Lower East Side while still a teenager. His criminal record eventually stretched back to 1926 and included charges ranging from robbery and grand larceny to assault and murder. During the 1930s and 1940s, Galante worked as an enforcer for Vito Genovese, one of the most powerful and feared figures in the New York Mafia, and according to widely reported accounts from that era, Galante was long suspected by investigators of carrying out a political assassination on Genovese's behalf, allegedly killing an anti-fascist Italian journalist in New York during World War II as a favor meant to curry favor with the Italian government. Galante was never formally charged in that particular killing, and the case officially remains unsolved, but the persistent suspicion surrounding it reflected the kind of reputation he had already built for himself as a man capable of extreme violence, carried out with total discretion. Galante's career took a significant turn upward when he became connected to Joseph Bonanno, the founder and longtime boss of the crime family that would eventually bear his name. Galante served as Bonanno's personal driver before rising to the position of underboss, becoming one of Bonanno's most trusted and capable lieutenants. In 1953, Bonanno sent Galante to Montreal, Quebec, to establish and run the family's heroin trafficking operations in Canada, working alongside a Canadian crime figure named Vincenzo Cotroni. Together, they built an extensive smuggling network that became known as part of what investigators later called the French Connection, importing massive quantities of heroin by ship into Montreal before smuggling it south into the United States. Galante's operation in Montreal also generated enormous profits from illegal gambling, reportedly collecting around $50 million a year at its peak. His aggressive and heavy-handed extortion tactics eventually caught the attention of Canadian authorities, and in April of 1956, the Canadian government deported him back to the United States. Even after being forced out of Canada, Galante remained deeply involved in international drug trafficking. In October of 1957, he attended a significant meeting at the Grand Hotel de Palm in Palermo, Sicily, alongside Joseph Bonanno, where the 2 men worked out plans for importing heroin into the United States, with a delegation of Sicilian mafia figures led by Giuseppe Genco Russo. Also present at meetings around this period was Charles Luciano, better known as Lucky Luciano, one of the most influential organized crime figures of the 20th century. As part of the arrangement worked out during these discussions, Several Sicilian mafia members would later travel to the United States to help expand the heroin pipeline that Galante had helped establish. That same October, Galante also attended the infamous Appalachian Meeting in upstate New York, a large gathering of organized crime bosses from across the country that was famously raided by state police, exposing the existence of a nationwide criminal network to the American public in a way that had never happened before. Galante's continued involvement in narcotics eventually caught up with him through the American legal system rather than through violence. He was indicted on drug trafficking charges between 1958 and 1960, and after an initial trial ended in a mistrial due to problems with the jury, a second trial in 1962 resulted in Galante being sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Galante was eventually paroled in 1974, walking out of prison into a Bonanno crime family that looked very different from the one he had left more than a decade earlier. Joseph Bonanno himself had long since been forced out of active leadership by the Commission, the governing body made up of bosses from the major New York families, and Philip Rastelli, known by the nickname Rusty, had been installed as the family's official boss. Despite Rastelli's official title, real power inside the family remained genuinely contested, and Galante, who had served as Rastelli's consigliere before his imprisonment, saw an opportunity to reclaim influence for himself. That opportunity expanded significantly in 1976 when Rastelli was sent back to prison on separate charges, leaving a leadership vacuum that Galante moved quickly to fill. Acting as the family's unofficial acting boss without formal approval from the wider commission, Galante began an aggressive campaign to seize control of lucrative narcotics markets that had traditionally been dominated by other families, particularly the Gambino family. By 1978, Galante had reportedly organized at least 8 murders of high-ranking Gambino family members who were heavily involved in the drug trade, a level of aggression that other crime bosses across New York found deeply alarming. Galante's ambitions grew bold enough that he began referring to himself, at least informally, as something close to a boss of bosses over the entire New York underworld, a title that no single family boss was supposed to claim under the power-sharing arrangement the Commission had maintained for decades. This kind of open defiance of the established order, combined with his aggressive moves against the Gambino family's drug operations, turned Galante into a serious problem for the leaders of the other 4 families. In March of 1978, Galante's parole was revoked by federal authorities over allegations that he had been associating improperly with other Bonanno mobsters, sending him back behind bars. However, on February 27, 1979, a judge ruled that the government had revoked his parole illegally and ordered his immediate release. Rather than moderating his behavior after this legal victory, Galante returned to the streets, more emboldened than ever, continuing his push to dominate the narcotics trade across New York. This combination of factors, his continued expansion into territory controlled by other families, his open disregard for the authority of the Commission, and his brazen public behavior, despite being one of the most closely watched criminals in the country, convinced the leaders of every major New York crime family, along with the retired but still respected Joseph Bonanno himself, that Galante needed to be eliminated. Genovese family boss Frank Thierry took the lead in building a consensus among the various family leaders that a hit on Galante needed to move forward, and he reportedly secured agreement even from the retired Bonanno, whose blessing carried significant symbolic weight given that Galante had once served as his trusted underboss. Philip Rastelli, still recognized as the Bonanno family's official boss despite his time in prison, formally sought approval from the Commission to have Galante killed, with a Bonanno soldier loyal to Rastelli named Joseph Massino relaying the request and receiving swift approval for the contract. Rastelli assigned two of his most trusted capos, Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sunny Red, and Dominic Napolitano, known as Sunny Black, to coordinate the details of how the killing would actually be carried out. Carrying out a hit against a man as heavily guarded and constantly alert as Galante required inside cooperation, and Indelicato and Napolitano found exactly the leverage they needed by approaching the two men who served as Galante's personal bodyguards, a pair of Sicilian-born mobsters named Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato, sometimes referred to collectively as part of the Zips, a nickname given to more recently arrived Sicilian mafia members operating out of Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn. Rastelli's faction offered Bonventre and Amato a promotion within the family, along with a larger share of the lucrative drug trafficking business in exchange for their cooperation in setting up their own boss to be killed. Both men agreed to the arrangement without hesitation. On July 12, 1979, Galante went to lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, a restaurant owned by his own cousin, Giuseppe Turano. Galante dined on the restaurant's open-air patio alongside Turano and a longtime Bonanno capo named Leonard Coppola, with his two bodyguards, Bonventre and Amato, joining the table a short time later. Despite the fact that it was a hot summer afternoon, both bodyguards were wearing leather jackets, a detail that later drew suspicion once it became clear they had likely worn the jackets for protection against stray gunfire during an attack they already knew was coming. At approximately 2:45 that afternoon, three men wearing ski masks suddenly appeared on the patio and opened fire with shotguns and handguns, killing Galante, Coppola, and Turano almost instantly before fleeing the scene. Galante was struck in the face during the attack, and in one of the most widely reproduced photographs in the history of American organized crime, his body was found with the cigar still clenched between his teeth, exactly as it had been throughout his entire adult life. Notably, Bonventre and Amato, the two bodyguards sitting at the same table, walked away from the shooting completely unharmed, a detail that made their true role in the killing obvious to anyone paying close attention to what had just happened. News of Galante's murder spread quickly and made headlines around the world, with newspapers running the photograph of his body on their front pages. The killing was so notorious within the Catholic community that the Archdiocese of New York publicly denied a request to hold a funeral mass for him, an unusual and pointed rejection that reflected just how far Galante's reputation for violence had spread even beyond law enforcement circles. In the immediate aftermath, Cesare Bonventre received exactly the reward he had been promised for his betrayal, becoming the youngest capo ever appointed within the Bonanno family at just 28 years old. Bonventre went on to become deeply involved in a scheme that investigators would later call the Pizza Connection, in which enormous quantities of heroin imported from Sicily were distributed through a network of pizza parlors across the United States, using the restaurants as fronts to disguise the true nature of the business being conducted inside them. Despite how widely understood the circumstances of Galante's murder eventually became within law enforcement and organized crime circles, the American justice system struggled for years to bring any real accountability for the killing. Only one man was ever formally convicted for his direct role in the shootings that killed Galante, Turano, and Coppola. Anthony Indelicato, known as Bruno, the son of Sunny Red Indelicato, one of the two capos who had helped orchestrate the hit, was eventually convicted during the landmark 1986 Mafia Commission trial, a case that successfully prosecuted the leadership of New York's organized crime families under federal racketeering laws for the first time in American history. Indelicato served 13 years in prison for his role in the killing. Neither Cesare Bonventre nor Baldo Amato, the two bodyguards whose cooperation had made the entire operation possible, ever faced criminal charges specifically connected to their role in setting up Galante's death, and the full extent of who fired the actual shots that day was never conclusively established in any courtroom. The killing of Galante did not bring lasting stability to the Bonanno family, the way its organizers had hoped. Tension continued to simmer between Rastelli's loyalists and a rival faction inside the family, and in May of 1981, 3 Bonanno capos, including Sonny Red Indelicato himself, along with fellow capos Dominic Trinchera and Philip Giacconi, were lured to a meeting at a Brooklyn social club and murdered by gunmen loyal to Rastelli's side of the family, an event that became known as the 3 Captains' Murders and was later depicted in the 1997 film Donnie Brasco. Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, one of the 2 capos who had helped arrange Galante's killing 2 years earlier, met his own violent end shortly afterward once it was discovered that he had unknowingly allowed an undercover FBI agent named Joseph Pistone, who had been operating under the alias Donnie Brasco since September of 1976, to infiltrate deep into his own crew over the course of several years. Even Cesare Bonventre, the bodyguard who had been rewarded so generously for betraying Galante, was eventually murdered himself in April of 1984, after family leadership came to view him as too much of a threat to their own continued control. His remains were later discovered stuffed inside 2 55-gallon glue drums, a grim final chapter for the man whose betrayal had made Galante's death possible in the first place. Philip Rastelli continued to lead the Bonanno family, largely from behind prison walls, until his death from cancer in 1991. Joseph Massino, the same soldier who had once relayed Rastelli's request for commission approval to kill Galante, eventually rose to become the Bonanno family's official boss that same year, earning a reputation as one of the most cautious and disciplined mob leaders in the country, going so far as to forbid his own men from saying his name aloud due to fear of FBI wiretaps. Massino's careful approach ultimately failed to protect him from federal prosecution. In July of 2004, he was convicted on charges connected to 8 murders, including the killing of Sonny Black Napolitano more than 2 decades earlier, and was sentenced to life in prison. Facing the possibility of the death penalty on additional charges, Massino made the unprecedented decision to become a government informant, the first official boss of an American mafia family in history to cooperate with federal investigators in that way. Information Massino provided directly led to the arrest of Vincent Basciano, known as Vinnie Gorgeous, who was serving as the Bonanno family's acting boss at the time, in November of 2004, closing a chapter of organized crime history that had begun decades earlier with Carmine Galante's rise through the ranks of the very family that eventually turned on him over lunch on a Brooklyn patio. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Galante was killed by 2 bodyguards who had quietly switched sides in exchange for a promotion, the final case on this list involves a much larger conspiracy, one that brought together 11 men from across an entire crime family to gun down their own boss outside a Manhattan steakhouse during the middle of the Christmas shopping season, an operation orchestrated by the very man who would take his place as leader within hours of the killing. Case 10. Paul, Big Paul, Castellano, Gambino crime family, 1985. Paul Castellano ran the Gambino crime family for nearly a decade, presiding over the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families, with a style that looked almost nothing like the popular image of a mob boss. He avoided the smoky social clubs and late-night card games that defined the public image of organized crime, preferring instead to run his criminal empire the way an executive might run a legitimate corporation, from behind the walls of a large mansion on Staten Island. On December 16, 1985, that carefully managed image ended in a hail of gunfire outside a Manhattan steakhouse during the height of the Christmas shopping season. Castellano was murdered on the direct order of one of his own capos, a man named John Gotti, who arranged for a team of 11 fellow Gambino family members, most of them fully initiated made men within the very organization Castellano led, to shoot him dead the moment he stepped out of his car. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn, the son of Italian immigrants Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano. His father worked as a butcher while also serving as an early member of what was then known as the Mangano crime family, the organization that would eventually evolve into the Gambino family. Growing up, Castellano learned both trades from his father, the honest work of butchering meat alongside the far less legitimate business of collecting money from illegal numbers games running through the neighborhood. He dropped out of school after the 8th grade and was first arrested at 19 years old in 1934 for robbing a haberdasher, a men's clothing shop, in Hartford, Connecticut. His family connections to organized crime ran deeper than his father's early involvement alone. In 1932, Castellano's sister Catherine married a cousin of theirs named Carlo Gambino, a union that made Castellano and Gambino both cousins and brothers-in-law, a family relationship that would eventually shape the entire trajectory of Castellano's criminal career. Castellano formally joined the Mangano crime family sometime during the 1940s, and his path upward accelerated dramatically after 1957, when his brother-in-law Carlo Gambino was elevated to the position of boss following the murder of the previous leader, Albert Anastasia. With Gambino now running what had become known as the Gambino crime family, Castellano rose to the rank of capo regime, meaning captain, placing him among the organization's most trusted leadership. That same year, Castellano attended the infamous Appalachian Meeting in upstate New York, a large gathering of organized crime bosses from across the country that was raided by New York State Police, resulting in Castellano's arrest, alongside more than 60 other high-ranking mobsters. The raid exposed the scale and coordination of American organized crime to the public in a way that had never happened before, and it marked Castellano as a known and watched figure within law enforcement circles for the rest of his life. Over the following decades, Castellano continued climbing within the Gambino organization, building a reputation as a shrewd businessman who preferred quiet, profitable enterprises over the flashier and more violent side of the criminal world. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, Castellano inherited leadership of the family, a decision that surprised and disappointed several senior figures within the organization who had expected Agnello Della Croce, a respected and battle-tested street boss, to take over instead. Della Croce had long operated the Gambino family's more traditional, street-level operations from the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy, and he commanded deep loyalty among the family's soldiers and capos who valued his hands-on leadership style. Gambino's decision to pass leadership to Castellano rather than Della Croce created a quiet but persistent tension within the family from the very beginning of Castellano's reign, one that would eventually contribute directly to his downfall nearly a decade later. Rather than trying to fully win over Della Croce's loyal followers, Castellano largely governed the family his own way, treating the organization more like a business empire than a traditional criminal brotherhood built on personal relationships and street credibility. Under Castellano's leadership, the Gambino family shifted much of its focus away from the traditional rackets that had defined organized crime for decades, moving instead toward what looked, at least on paper, like legitimate business activity. Castellano built influence across the construction industry, meat distribution, trucking, and labor unions, along with extensive bid rigging and extortion schemes running through New York's garment district. He earned the nickname the Howard Hughes of the Mafia, a comparison to the reclusive billionaire businessman because of how rarely he appeared in public and how tightly he controlled information about his activities. This business-focused approach to leadership put Castellano increasingly at odds with younger, more aggressive members of the family, particularly a capo named John Gotti, who had come up through hijackings, extortion, and street-level violence rather than boardroom-style deal-making. Gotti had been a protege of Della Croce for years, and his loyalty remained firmly with the underboss rather than with Castellano, a divide that ran straight through the heart of the Gambino organization throughout the early 1980s. Several specific conflicts deepened the rift between Castellano and Gotti as the years went on. Castellano had banned members of the family from participating in the drug trade, worried that narcotics trafficking would draw exactly the kind of intense federal attention that could threaten the entire organization's more profitable, less visible business activities. Gotti, however, was widely believed to be ignoring this ban and continuing to profit from drug dealing through members of his own crew, a direct act of defiance against Castellano's authority. The two men also had a long-running financial dispute over how profits from hijackings at John F. Kennedy International Airport, a lucrative criminal enterprise that Gotti had long been involved in, should be divided between Gotti's crew and the family's top leadership. In January of 1983, Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of a Gambino capo named Roy DeMeo, whose body was found shot to death inside the trunk of his own Cadillac, reportedly because DeMeo's extensive involvement in drug trafficking and other violent crimes had become too dangerous a liability for the organization. 2 months after that killing, the FBI obtained a warrant to install secret listening devices inside Castellano's own Staten Island mansion, timing the operation for a period when Castellano was away on vacation in Florida, drugging his guard dogs and disabling his security system in order to plant the devices undetected. The final chain of events that led directly to Castellano's death began on December 2nd, 1985, when Agnello Della Croce died of cancer after a long illness. Castellano's decision not to attend Della Croce's wake was interpreted by Gotti and other members of the Manhattan-based faction of the family as a deep and deliberate insult toward a man who had served the organization loyally for decades. Rather than easing tensions after Della Croce's death, Castellano made matters worse by naming Thomas Bilotti, a loyal but diplomatically unskilled ally, as the family's new underboss, a decision that many within the organization saw as a clear sign that Castellano intended to sideline Della Croce's old faction entirely. Castellano also reportedly hinted around this time that he planned to break up Gotti's crew altogether, a threat that, combined with everything else, convinced Gotti and his closest allies that Castellano needed to be removed from power before he could act against them first. Sammy Gravano, a Gambino capo who would later become one of the most important cooperating witnesses in the history of American organized crime prosecutions, initially suggested killing Castellano and Bilotti together while the two men were eating breakfast at a diner, a simpler and less public setting for the hit. The plan changed when Frank DeCicco, another Gambino capo, secretly conspiring with Gotti against Castellano, learned that Castellano had scheduled a meeting with several other mobsters at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan on December 16, 1985. Gotti and his fellow conspirators decided this meeting presented the opportunity they needed, and they quickly organized a team to carry out the killing at the restaurant instead. According to testimony Gravano later gave in federal court, the operation ultimately involved 11 men, 4 shooters, along with several backup men and getaway drivers, all of them Gambino family members, and most of them fully initiated made men within the organization. The shooters dressed in matching beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, an unusual and coordinated appearance that made the operation look almost military in its planning and precision. On the evening of December 16, 1985, Thomas Bilotti drove Castellano to Sparks Steakhouse for the scheduled meeting. The hit team had already positioned themselves near the restaurant entrance, waiting for Castellano's car to arrive. Gotti and Gravano watched the entire operation unfold from inside a Lincoln sedan parked across the street, coordinating with the shooters through walkie-talkies that alerted the team the moment Castellano's limousine came into view. When Castellano and Bilotti stepped out of the car at around 5:30 in the evening, the gunmen opened fire immediately. Castellano was shot 6 times, and Bilotti, who attempted to draw his own weapon and fire back in defense, was struck 4 times before falling dead in the street beside his boss. After confirming that both men were dead, Gotti drove his car slowly past the bodies to make certain the job had been completed successfully before heading south on 2nd Avenue back toward Brooklyn, leaving behind one of the most brazen and publicly visible assassinations in the history of American organized crime, carried out in the middle of Manhattan during the busiest shopping season of the year. The killing of Castellano set off immediate and far-reaching consequences within New York's criminal underworld. Just 2 weeks after the murder, Gotti was formally elected as the new boss of the Gambino crime family, stepping directly into the leadership position that his conspiracy had violently created. This rapid ascension did not sit well with every other family boss in New York. Vincent Gigante, who led the Genovese crime family, was reportedly outraged that Gotti had ordered the killing of a fellow boss without first seeking approval from the commission, the governing body of family leaders that was traditionally supposed to authorize any hit against a sitting boss. Gigante enlisted the help of Anthony Corallo, boss of the Lucchese crime family, in planning retaliation against Gotti for this breach of mafia protocol. On April 13, 1986, a car bomb intended to kill Gotti exploded outside a social club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Gotti himself survived, but the blast killed Frank DeCicco, the very capo who had originally tipped Gotti off about Castellano's dinner reservation at Sparks Steakhouse, a grim irony that saw one of the conspiracy's key architects killed in an attack meant for the man he had helped install as boss. No formal criminal trial ever took place specifically addressing the murder of Paul Castellano in the years immediately following his death, largely because investigators lacked the direct evidence needed to bring charges, and much of what actually happened remained known only to the small circle of men who had planned and carried it out. That changed years later, after federal authorities arrested Gotti in late 1990 on a range of racketeering charges and denied him bail just 10 days afterward. Sammy Gravano, who had participated directly in planning and watching Castellano's murder, made the extraordinary decision to become a cooperating witness for the government 4 months before Gotti's trial began, providing prosecutors with detailed first-hand testimony about the killing and Gotti's broader criminal enterprise. On April 2, 1992, based substantially on Gravano's testimony, along with wiretap evidence gathered over years of investigation, Gotti was convicted on numerous racketeering charges, including the murder of Paul Castellano. On June 23, 1992, a federal judge sentenced Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite Gravano's extensive cooperation and detailed knowledge of exactly who had participated in the shooting outside Sparks Steakhouse, no one else was ever formally charged in connection with Castellano's murder. Gotti spent the remainder of his life behind bars, eventually dying of throat cancer in 2002 while while still serving his life sentence. Before his conviction, Gotti had earned a reputation in the press as the Teflon Don, a nickname reflecting his remarkable ability to avoid conviction across several earlier trials throughout the 1980s, and his eventual downfall through Gravano's cooperation marked one of the most significant victories federal prosecutors had ever achieved against organized crime in New York. The killing of Castellano itself is widely regarded by historians of American organized crime as a genuine turning point, not just for the Gambino family, but for the entire structure of the five families as they had operated for most of the 20th century. The brazen, highly public nature of the hit, carried out on a busy Manhattan street during the holiday season without any commission approval, shattered the fragile balance of power and mutual restraint that had allowed the different families to coexist without regularly killing each other's leadership. In the decades that followed, the assassination of a sitting New York mafia boss became an extraordinarily rare event. When another Gambino family boss, Frank Cali, was shot and killed outside his Staten Island home in March of 2019, news outlets across the country described it as the first killing of a New York mafia don since Gotti had ordered Castellano's death more than 3 decades earlier, a reflection of just how significant and destabilizing the events outside Sparks Steakhouse had truly been. Across every case examined in this look at bosses, brought down by the very men closest to them, from Mexican cartel founders shot inside the vehicles of trusted partners, to Colombian kingpins murdered by lieutenants they had personally promoted, the pattern remains strikingly consistent. Power built through fear and loyalty can collapse in an instant the moment those closest to the top decide that removing their boss serves their own interests better than protecting him, and no amount of wealth, violence, or years of trust ever fully guarantees safety from the people standing nearest at the moment it matters most. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.